Jessica thought her life was headed toward a bright future full of love. But when her heart was broken by the man she thought she'd marry, she made a desperate decision. Forced into a marriage with a wealthy older man, she found herself stepping into a world filled with cold calculations, not affection. As the days pass, she begins to question her choices, especially when a mysterious connection develops between her and her husband's nephew. Unbeknownst to her, she is a pawn in a much darker game of revenge where love, betrayal, and power clash. As secrets unravel, Jessica must confront her feelings and decide whether she will accept her fate or fight for her freedom. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell to avoid missing any videos. Before we dive into this story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Jessica stood frozen in front of the mirror, her breath shallow as her wide eyes stared back at a beautiful stranger, draped in white satin, her veil perfectly placed, her makeup accentuating a youthfulness that felt like a mask. Her fingers trembled over the bouquet, but beneath the image of a flawless bride, a storm raged within her soul. She never thought her life would spiral into this cold reality. Her heart was shattered, her dreams twisted into something unrecognizable. Gone were the hopes of love, replaced by the harsh realization of a future she never wanted. Just a year ago, she was wrapped in the warm embrace of David, her first love, believing in forever. But David had walked away, leaving her abandoned in a sea of heartache, without a single explanation. In her brokenness, she made the reckless decision to marry Richard, a wealthy older man, not out of love, but to numb the pain David had inflicted. She felt like a marionette in someone else's twisted play. "Jessica, are you ready?" Her sister Valeria's gentle voice pierced through the suffocating silence, laced with concern as she watched Jessica force a smile. That smile, so hollow, so painful, was a mask, covering the resignation deep within. "Yes, I'm ready," she lied, as a scream clawed at her insides, desperate to escape. As the door clicked shut behind Valeria, Jessica turned to the mirror one last time, her heart heavy with regret. "Why am I doing this?" The question echoed in her mind, but she knew the answer. She was marrying Richard to bury her pain, to show David she could move on, even if it meant walking down the aisle towards a life she didn't want, with a man she didn't love. The wedding music jolted her back to reality. It was time. With a deep, unsteady breath, she forced herself to take step after step, each one heavier than the last, as though her body was resisting the life she was about to surrender to. Richard stood at the altar, imposing and stoic in a tailored black suit, his eyes cold and calculating, locked onto her. There was no love, no warmth, just the unspoken understanding of the deal they had struck, a contract sealed not with passion, but with practicality. As Jessica took his hand, the coldness of his skin sent a shiver through her spine. His grip was firm, almost as if to remind her that she was now bound to him, to this life of emptiness. "You look beautiful," he murmured, but the words were as lifeless as the ceremony itself. They held no meaning, no affection. She nodded, her throat too tight to respond. Her soul screamed for an escape, but it was too late. The life she once dreamed of, filled with love and joy, was gone. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Her gaze wandered, scanning the sea of faces until she found one pair of eyes that unsettled her. Michael, Richard's nephew. His intense stare bore into her, cutting through the pretense of her new life. He was younger, closer to her age, and though they had met briefly before, she felt a connection that both frightened and intrigued her. His gaze held something she couldn't quite grasp, a silent warning that the future she was walking into was far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. The priest's voice droned on, a distant murmur against the roar of thoughts in Jessica's head. The vows meant nothing, hollow words that echoed in the vast emptiness of her heart. When the moment came, she hesitated. "Do you take Richard as your husband?" the priest asked, and for a heartbeat she considered running. But the weight of her decision crashed down on her, and with a voice void of emotion she whispered, "Yes, I do." The applause of the guests felt like the closing clap of a prison door. As she walked down the aisle, Richard's hand gripping her arm, the life she had once imagined seemed to drift further and further away. Yet, even amid this suffocating reality, she couldn't shake the feeling of Michael's eyes on her, watching her every move, as if he knew something she didn't. His presence unsettled her, but it also stirred something deep inside, a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time. The reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and polite conversations, but Jessica was trapped in her thoughts, her body tense as she tried to navigate this new world. And every time Michael's gaze caught hers, she felt a flicker of something dangerous, something that whispered to her that this marriage was far from simple and that the story she had just begun was only the start of a far more treacherous journey. That night, when she finally retreated to her room, she closed the door and let out a deep, shuddering breath. The weight of her decision settled heavily on her chest. She had married a man she didn't love, for reasons that felt more hollow with every passing moment. And yet, as she sank onto the bed, exhausted and overwhelmed, it wasn't Richard's face that haunted her thoughts. It was Michael's intense, unsettling gaze, a gaze that promised her this nightmare was far from over. The day after the wedding, the air in Richard's mansion was suffocatingly still. The staff moved quietly, cleaning up the remnants of a night that had felt more like a ceremony of surrender than a celebration. Sunlight slowly crept through the large windows, but it brought no warmth to the cold, cavernous halls. Jessica awoke with a strange hollowness in her chest, a sense of loss she couldn't quite place. The night had been long, filled with forced smiles, empty conversations, and the relentless weight of feeling trapped in a life that wasn't her own. Slowly, she rose from the vast, unfamiliar bed. The room was as luxurious as it was stifling. Every inch of Richard's house screamed wealth and power, but none of it brought her comfort. The high ceilings, the opulent furnishings, everything seemed designed to remind her of the cold reality she now lived in. She walked to the balcony, hoping the fresh air would clear her mind. As she looked out at the sprawling gardens, bathed in the fragile morning light, memories of the previous night flooded her senses. She smiled, thanked the guests, and played the role of the dutiful bride. But throughout it all, one face haunted her thoughts: Michael. That name echoed in her mind. His eyes had followed her all night, not with the gaze of a casual onlooker, but with an intensity that unnerved her. It was as if Michael could see through the mask she wore, peeling away the layers of pretense to glimpse the raw, wounded soul beneath. The connection she felt to him, though brief, was unsettling, far more real than anything she had with Richard. And yet, she knew she had to push those thoughts away. Michael was her husband's nephew, and nothing more. When she descended for breakfast, she found Richard, as always, engrossed in his work. His attention was buried in a stack of documents, as if the wedding had been nothing more than an item to check off his to-do list. He glanced up briefly, his voice detached. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, more out of habit than concern. "Yes, thank you," Jessica replied, forcing a smile that barely concealed her growing disillusionment. She sat down at the table, and the silence between them thickened, heavy with the absence of affection or warmth. Was this her future, trapped in a loveless marriage with a man whose heart seemed made of stone? Just as the suffocating silence became unbearable, the door opened, and Michael entered the room. His presence was like a spark, instantly shifting the energy in the space. Dressed casually, but with a confidence that made him stand out, Michael's gaze flicked briefly to Jessica before turning to Richard. "Uncle, may I interrupt for a moment?" he asked, his tone respectful but firm. Richard looked up, clearly irritated by the interruption, but gestured for him to continue. "What is it, Michael?" "I wanted to confirm the meeting for this afternoon. There are a few details we need to finalize before the partners arrive," Michael said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. Jessica watched them closely, noticing the cold formality in their exchange. There was no familial warmth, no bond of affection, just business, always business. Richard nodded, barely looking up from his documents. "We'll go over it after breakfast," he said curtly. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "And Michael, I'd like a moment alone with Jessica before we start the day." Michael nodded, but before leaving, his eyes lingered on Jessica for a moment longer than was appropriate. There was something in his gaze, a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just curiosity, it was as if he could see the storm brewing inside her, the turmoil she was trying so hard to hide. "Of course, sorry for the interruption," Jessica, Michael said with a slight smile before turning and leaving the room. The door closed, and the oppressive silence returned. Jessica tried to focus on her breakfast, but her thoughts were racing, tangled up in the conflicting emotions that Michael had stirred. She couldn't deny the effect he had on her, though she desperately wanted to. There was something dangerous in that attraction, something she knew she had no right to feel. "Michael is very capable," Richard said suddenly, his voice breaking through her thoughts as if he had sensed where her mind had wandered. His eyes remained fixed on his papers. "He's young but sharp. If he stays focused, he'll take over the business one day." Jessica nodded absently, unsure how to respond. She wasn't thinking about Michael's business acumen, she was thinking about the way his gaze had lingered on her, the way he seemed to see through her in a way Richard never could. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but Jessica's thoughts never strayed far from Michael. His presence lingered in her mind like an unanswered question, one that both intrigued and terrified her. That evening, as she wandered through the garden, she overheard voices coming from Richard's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she recognized Michael's voice, speaking in low, urgent tones. "There's more at stake here than you realize," Uncle Michael said, his voice tense with an emotion Jessica couldn't quite place. "I know what I'm doing," Richard replied coldly. "Everything is under control." Jessica's heart raced as she backed away from the door. What were they talking about? What secrets lay beneath the surface of this cold, calculated life she had married into? And why did she feel as though Michael was the key to uncovering them? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this marriage, this life with Richard, was far from what it seemed. There were layers of deception, shadows of secrets she hadn't yet begun to understand. But one thing was clear. She couldn't ignore the pull she felt towards Michael. It was a dangerous pull, but it was also the first thing that had made her feel truly alive since she had walked down that aisle. For the first time since her wedding, Jessica felt the stirrings of something more than resignation. She didn't know where this would lead her, but she knew one thing for certain: she was no longer content to be a passive player in this cold, emotionless world. Something had awakened within her, and she wasn't about to let it go. Weeks passed, and the cold routine of Richard's house became an inescapable prison for Jessica. The wedding had been a prelude to a life she had once imagined would provide stability, but instead left her feeling hollow, suffocated by the cold, mechanical luxury that surrounded her. Richard remained exactly the man she had first met: calculated, methodical, and always deeply immersed in his business dealings. But something within Jessica had begun to shift. Despite her efforts to suppress it, Michael's presence had become a storm in her mind, impossible to silence. Richard, as always, seemed oblivious, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He was perpetually absorbed in meetings, business calls, or hosting events, leaving Jessica to navigate the vast, empty mansion alone. They exchanged few words beyond the polite pleasantries that kept their facade intact, and Jessica could no longer shake the feeling that their marriage was nothing more than an elaborate performance. One afternoon, with Richard away in yet another meeting, Jessica sought refuge in the garden. The stifling air of the house pressed down on her until she could barely breathe, and the fresh air outside offered a fleeting sense of escape. As she wandered the garden paths, lost in the soothing rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds, her mind drifted to the life she had imagined for herself, a life far removed from this one. And then she saw him, Michael. He emerged from the far side of the garden, his presence cutting through the stillness like a blade. Their eyes locked, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to fall away. Every encounter with him stirred something in her she dared not acknowledge, a connection that felt both magnetic and dangerous. "Are you escaping too?" Michael asked, his voice laced with a light-hearted smile that belied the intensity in his gaze. He moved towards her with an ease that made Jessica's heart quicken, though she tried to steady her breath. She returned his smile faintly but hesitated, unable to find the words to match her turbulent emotions. "Sometimes this house feels like a cage," she confessed, her voice softer, more vulnerable than she intended. Michael studied her for a long moment, as if he understood exactly what she was saying, even if the words remained unspoken. He stepped closer, standing beside her, both of them staring out at the endless horizon. "You're not the only one who feels that way," he said, his voice carrying a weight of sadness she hadn't expected. Jessica glanced at him, her curiosity piqued. What did Michael, with his confident demeanor and privileged life, have to feel trapped about? "It's hard to believe that you, of all people, could feel stuck. You seem to have everything anyone could want," she ventured, trying to keep her tone light, though her heart pounded in her chest. Michael's expression darkened slightly, his smile fading. "What you see isn't always the truth, Jessica. Things are happening here, things you don't know about. Things you couldn't even imagine." His words hung heavy in the air, unsettling her. There was a depth to him she had never anticipated, a hidden layer of frustration or pain that intrigued her even as it frightened her. Before Jessica could press him for more, Michael forced a smile, changing the subject as if the moment of vulnerability had never occurred. "Would you like to walk with me? It's easier to enjoy this place when you're not alone." His offer was casual, but the underlying tension between them was unmistakable. Jessica hesitated, knowing that this was a line she shouldn't cross, yet the pull she felt towards Michael was too strong to ignore. Finally, she nodded, and together they walked through the garden, exchanging trivial pleasantries as the unspoken bond between them deepened with every step. What neither of them realized was that from the shadows of an upstairs window, Richard was watching. He had noticed the subtle exchanges between Jessica and Michael for weeks, and had sensed the shift in Jessica's demeanor, the way her eyes brightened whenever his nephew was near. None of it surprised him. He had expected this from the very beginning. Richard wasn't angry. He wasn't even jealous. For him, this was all part of a larger plan, a game he had been playing long before Jessica had ever stepped foot into his life. Michael and Jessica were merely pawns on his chessboard, pieces he could manipulate to achieve his ends. He had foreseen the attraction between them and knew it was inevitable. And now, watching them from the distance, he saw the opportunity he had been waiting for. Later that evening, when Jessica returned to the house after dinner, she was surprised to find Richard seated in the armchair by the window. It was an unusual sight. Richard rarely spent time in the shared spaces of their home, preferring the isolation of his office. The sight of him sitting there waiting for her sent a chill down her spine. Jessica Richard's voice was calm, devoid of the sharpness she had come to expect. He looked up from the book in his hands, his gaze piercing but unreadable. "I thought we could talk." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Jessica froze in the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something in the air, something heavy, ominous. She had the distinct feeling that this conversation would be unlike any they'd had before. Slowly, she stepped into the room, knowing that whatever Richard had planned would change everything. Jessica's pulse quickened as Michael's words echoed through her mind. The once quiet and oppressive mansion had become a labyrinth of emotional turmoil and secrets. Every corner seemed darker now, every shadow concealing more than she could comprehend. Michael's presence, so magnetic and dangerous, filled the room, adding weight to her already burdened thoughts. She couldn't shake the memory of her conversation with Richard the day before. His calm, almost dispassionate acceptance of her growing connection to Michael had unsettled her deeply. It wasn't the indifference itself that unnerved her, but the way he had framed it, as though he had always expected it, as if her desires and emotions were another calculated move in his game. The idea that he had been watching her all this time, quietly orchestrating everything, left her feeling exposed, like a pawn on his chessboard. "Is everything okay?" Jessica had asked Richard that day, her voice betraying the unease that had settled over her ever since she'd begun to notice the shift in their interactions. Richard's response, though gentle in tone, had been full of veiled menace. "I was wondering if we could talk," he had said, setting aside the book he was reading, the ever-present mask of polite control on his face. As he rose from his chair and crossed the room to her, Jessica had felt an almost palpable tension in the air, as if the very walls of the mansion were holding their breath, waiting for something to unravel. When she had asked him what he wanted to talk about, her nerves had been on edge. Richard had never been one for personal conversations. Their marriage had been built on formality, on cold, detached exchanges that barely scratched the surface of their lives. But this was different. The intensity in Richard's gaze as he looked at her, the way he had spoken her name with a softness that belied his true intentions, it all pointed to something deeper, something darker. "I know you feel lonely here, Jessica," he had said, his voice gentle yet unnerving, as though he were discussing something as mundane as the weather. "And I know this probably wasn't the marriage you dreamed of, but what I don't want is for you to feel trapped." His words had unsettled her, not just because they were true, but because of the way he had said them, as if he had been reading her mind, as if her loneliness and dissatisfaction had been part of his plan all along. She had tried to brush it off, insisting that she was fine, but they both knew the lie for what it was. And then, without warning, Richard had dropped the bombshell. "You have Michael," he had said, his voice cool and measured, his eyes studying her reaction. Jessica's heart had stuttered in her chest at the mention of Michael's name. She had struggled to maintain her composure, not understanding how much Richard knew or what he was implying. When she had tried to deny it, Richard's smile had taken on a darker edge, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't have to hide it, Jessica," he had said. "I know you spend time with him. I encourage it. I want you to feel comfortable here, and if Michael can offer you something that I can't, then so be it." The way he had said it, so nonchalant, so matter-of-fact, had left Jessica reeling. It wasn't just that Richard knew about her growing feelings for Michael, it was that he wanted it. He was allowing it, even encouraging it. But why? The question had gnawed at her then, and it gnawed at her now. Was Richard testing her? Was this some twisted form of control to see how far he could push her, how much he could manipulate her emotions. Or was it something else entirely, something she hadn't yet begun to understand? And now, here she was, sitting in the grand, empty hall, with Michael standing just a few steps away from her, his presence as overwhelming as ever. The light filtering through the windows cast long, dramatic shadows across the floor, making the room feel like a stage, with her and Michael the only players in some tragic, hidden drama. "I needed to see you," Michael repeated, his voice quieter now, filled with an emotion Jessica couldn't quite place. Was it a concern, fear, or something more dangerous, something that mirrored her growing desperation? Jessica took a deep breath, her mind still racing from the conversation she'd had with Richard. The fact that her husband knew about her relationship with Michael, and worse, that he seemed to welcome it, had thrown her into a whirlwind of confusion. She didn't know what to think anymore. She didn't know whom to trust. "Michael, this is wrong," she said softly, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. She knew what she was feeling, knew the pull she felt towards him was undeniable, but everything about this situation was twisted. How could she pursue anything with Michael when Richard seemed to be manipulating them both? Michael moved closer, his eyes locked onto hers, filled with the same unspoken tension that had been building between them for weeks. "It's not wrong, Jessica," he said, his voice low and intense. "The only thing wrong here is how Richard is playing us." Jessica looked away, unable to meet his gaze, her thoughts swirling in confusion and fear. "But why, Michael? Why would Richard do this? He knows about us and he's encouraging it. None of this makes sense." Michael let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Because it's not about you or me. It's about control. Richard doesn't care about love, Jessica. He cares about power. And as long as he feels like he has control over both of us, he's fine with whatever happens. He's manipulating us for his purposes." The words hung in the air like a poison, sinking into Jessica's mind as she tried to process them. It was all too much: Richard's cold indifference, his twisted permission, and now Michael's confirmation that they were both caught in some kind of cruel, calculated game. She stood up, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her. "What do we do, Michael?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "How do we escape this?" Michael stepped closer, his presence both comforting and terrifying at the same time. "We find a way out," he said firmly, his eyes never leaving hers. "We don't let Richard control us anymore." His words stirred something deep inside her, a flicker of hope amidst the growing darkness. But even as she felt that hope, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than either of them realized. Richard wasn't just a man to be defied, he was a master manipulator, always 10 steps ahead. And if he had anticipated this, if he had planned for her and Michael to become closer, then what was his endgame? The sound of footsteps from the hallway made Jessica's heart leap into her throat. She turned sharply, her breath catching as she feared that Richard might appear at any moment. But the footsteps faded away, and she realized it was only the staff moving about. Michael reached out, gently touching her arm, and the warmth of his touch sent a shock through her system. "Jessica," he said softly, "I won't let him hurt you. Whatever happens, we'll get through this together." But Jessica wasn't sure if anyone could protect her from Richard's web of control. She wasn't sure if she could even protect herself. Jessica's words hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the devastation she was feeling. The world she thought she knew was unraveling before her eyes, every thread of trust fraying into something darker and more sinister. Her chest tightened with the weight of it all: her father's betrayal, Richard's manipulation, and now the realization that Michael, the one person she had felt some sort of connection to, was wrapped up in it too. The pain was unbearable, like the floor beneath her feet had been yanked away, leaving her suspended in a void. Michael's expression softened, his face etched with regret as he stepped closer. "I understand why you don't trust me, Jessica," he said quietly, his voice laced with a sorrow that felt genuine. "I wish I had seen the truth sooner, that I had been able to stop this before it reached you. But I didn't. I was just another pawn in Richard's plan, just like you." Jessica wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that Michael was as much a victim as she was, that together they could break free from this twisted game Richard was playing. But how could she trust him? The man who had stood by Richard's side for years, who had known about the power plays and the dark secrets of the family business, and yet had remained silent until now. The storm inside her raged as she struggled to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. She turned away from Michael, her breath shaky as she tried to regain some control over the chaos in her mind. "You were part of it," she said, her voice cracking. "Even if you didn't know everything, you were still part of Richard's world. How can I trust that you're not just another piece in his plan?" Michael took a deep breath, his gaze intense as he stepped even closer, gently reaching out to touch her arm. "Because I care about you, Jessica," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. "I never wanted this to happen. And now that I know the truth, I will do whatever it takes to protect you. I'll get you out of here, away from Richard and his games." Jessica felt his touch like a lifeline, but the darkness that clouded her thoughts made it difficult to see the light. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but at the same time, a part of her wanted to collapse into his arms, to let someone else bear the weight of this nightmare. She had been so strong for so long, holding herself together in a marriage that had never been about love, but now, faced with the ugly truth, she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. "You don't understand," she whispered, shaking her head. "Everything I thought I knew is gone. My father, my marriage, all of it was a lie. And now you're telling me that I was part of some revenge plot, that Richard married me because of something my father did. How am I supposed to move forward knowing all of this?" Michael's hand tightened gently on her arm, pulling her closer until they were standing face to face. His eyes searched hers, filled with a desperation that mirrored her own. "You move forward by not letting Richard win," he said firmly, "by not letting him control your life any longer. He has manipulated you, used you as a pawn, but that doesn't mean you can't take back control." Jessica looked into Michael's eyes, searching for some sign that he was telling the truth. And for the first time since their conversation had begun, she saw something real, not just desire or concern, but a genuine sense of responsibility and regret. But was that enough? Could she trust him after everything she had been through? Her silence stretched between them, thick with uncertainty. She took a step back, needing space to think, to breathe. "I need time, Michael," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to figure out what to do next." Michael's face fell, but he nodded, understanding the weight of her decision. "I'll give you the time you need," he said, his voice low. "But remember, Jessica, whatever happens, you're not alone in this. I'll be here when you're ready." Jessica nodded but didn't reply. She couldn't yet bring herself to accept his help or his presence. Too much had happened, and the walls around her heart were too high for her to let anyone in. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing alone in the grand hall, the silence between them louder than any words could have been. As she climbed the stairs back to the solitude of her room, Jessica's thoughts churned in a storm of confusion, pain, and fear. Her father had been part of something far darker than she had ever known, and Richard had married her for reasons that had nothing to do with love. She felt like a puppet, every string pulled by a man who watched her every move with cold calculation. She reached her room and closed the door, leaning against it as her legs gave out beneath her. The tears she had been holding back finally broke free, streaming down her face as the weight of everything she had learned crashed down on her. She wept for her father, for the trust that had been shattered, for the love she had never found, and for the life that had been nothing but a series of lies. And yet, amid her pain, there was a flicker of something else, a spark of anger, of determination. Richard had used her, manipulated her, and controlled every aspect of her life, but she wasn't going to let him continue. She wasn't going to be a pawn in his twisted game any longer. As the tears subsided and her breathing slowed, Jessica made a silent vow to herself. She would find a way to break free from Richard's grasp. She would uncover the truth about her father, about the betrayal that had set all of this in motion, and she would take back control of her life, no matter what it took. But for now, she would wait. She would be patient, just as Richard had taught her to be. Because in this game of power and manipulation, the most important thing was not to make a move too soon. Jessica knew that now. And when the time came, she would make sure her move was the one that ended the game for good. Jessica opened the door slowly, her heart pounding as she stepped into Michael's room. The soft glow of a single lamp illuminated his figure as he sat in a chair by the window, gazing out into the darkness. His back was tense, as if he, too, was carrying the weight of everything that had unfolded between them. "Jessica," Michael said, turning to face her, his voice soft but full of concern. The lines on his face were deeper now, weighed down by guilt and regret. He could see the storm brewing in her eyes, the pain she was trying to mask. He stood up, taking a step toward her, but she raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "I need answers, Michael," she said, her voice firmer than before. The vulnerability she had shown earlier had been replaced by a desperate need for clarity. No more lies. No more half-truths. I need to know what's going on. Michael's face tightened. He had expected this moment, but facing it was something else entirely. He nodded, gesturing for her to sit, but Jessica remained standing, her arms crossed defensively. Richard told me everything, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. He admitted that my marriage to him was part of a plan to punish my father, that I was nothing more than a pawn in his twisted revenge. Michael sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he processed her words. I was afraid of this, he muttered. He looked up at her, his gaze filled with regret. I never wanted you to find out like this. Jessica's eyes narrowed. What do you mean, find out? Did you know? You knew this whole time. Michael shook his head, his eyes pleading with her to understand. Not from the beginning, no, but over time I started to piece things together. Richard never tells anyone everything, Jessica. He always has his secrets and always has plans in motion that no one knows about. But I started to see the way he looked at you, the way he manipulated everything around him. I didn't want to believe it at first, but it all made sense. And when I realized what was happening, it was too late. Jessica's chest tightened, the weight of betrayal pressing down on her. She took a step back, her mind spinning. So you just let it happen. You knew what Richard was doing to me, and you didn't stop it. Michael's eyes darkened with frustration, his voice rising. Do you think I had any power to stop him? Do you think anyone does? Richard controls everything, Jessica. He's always one step ahead, always pulling the strings. By the time I realized what was happening, I was already part of his game, just like you. But that doesn't mean I didn't care. That doesn't mean I don't care now. Jessica's breath caught in her throat, emotion swirling inside her. She had never felt more betrayed, more alone. And what about us, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Was that part of his plan too? Was I just another piece on his chessboard, something for you to toy with while he watched? Michael's face softened, his eyes filling with a pain that mirrored her own. No, Jessica, whatever this is between us, it's real. It was never part of Richard's plan. He may have seen it as an advantage, but I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. Jessica turned away, wrapping her arms around herself as she tried to make sense of everything. The walls of the room seemed to close in on her, the air heavy with unspoken truths. I don't know what to believe anymore, she said softly, her voice breaking. Michael stepped forward, his hand hovering near her shoulder but not quite touching her. You can believe this, he said quietly. I'm not going to let Richard win. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to find a way to stop him. I'm going to protect you, Jessica. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 3 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his for any sign of deception, but all she saw was sincerity, mixed with the same guilt and regret that weighed on her. A part of her wanted to believe him, to trust that Michael could be her ally in this nightmare. But another part of her, the part that had been shattered by Richard's manipulation, couldn't shake the fear that she was still being played. I don't know if I can trust you, Michael, she whispered, her voice trembling. You've been part of Richard's world for so long. How do I know you're not still under his control? Michael's eyes flashed with determination. Because I'm not. I'm done playing his games. I'm done letting him manipulate us. You and I, we're in this together now, Jessica. We have to be, if we're going to take him down. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and hope swirling inside her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that Michael could be the one person who stood by her side in this twisted world. But trust was something that had been stripped from her piece by Richard's cold, calculating mind. As the silence stretched between them, Michael took a deep breath, his gaze steady. I'll prove it to you, he said, his voice firm. Whatever it takes, I'll show you that I'm not part of Richard's plan. But you need to trust me. Just enough to let me help you. Jessica looked into his eyes, searching for the truth. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw something real, something she could hold on to, even if just for a moment. I don't know what's going to happen next, she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. But I don't want to be alone in this. Michael nodded, his expression softening. You won't be. We'll figure this out together. For the first time that night, Jessica felt a small flicker of hope. It was fragile, easily extinguished, but it was there. And right now, that was enough. But even as she allowed herself to feel that flicker, a part of her remained wary, knowing that Richard's reach was long and his plans ran deep. This was only the beginning of a battle that would test everything she thought she knew about Michael, about herself, and about the man who controlled their lives. And as she stood in the quiet room, she made a vow to herself. No matter how long it took, no matter how dangerous it became, she would find a way to escape Richard's grip. She would no longer be a pawn in his twisted game. But for now, she needed Michael. She needed his help, his knowledge, and his strength. Together, they would find a way to bring Richard down. Michael took a deep breath, his gaze locked with Jessica's. The weight of their shared desperation thickened the air. He hesitated, knowing the enormity of what he was about to suggest, but there was no other way. They had to act now, or risk being crushed beneath Richard's unforgiving game. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he began, his voice low but steady. "Richard's power, his control over everything, it's all built on secrets and fear. That's how he's managed to keep everyone under his thumb. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of unraveling when exposed to the right light." Jessica frowned, trying to grasp his meaning. "What are you saying, Michael? That we expose him?" Michael nodded slowly. "Yes, if we can find proof of what he's done, of the lengths he's gone to manipulate people, we can take that power away from him. Richard thrives on the fact that no one can challenge him. He thinks he's untouchable, but he's not. If we can gather enough evidence, we can bring him down." Jessica's heart raced at the idea, her mind racing with both hope and fear. But how? Richard has been careful. He won't leave traces of his crimes out in the open for us to find. Michael nodded, his expression grim. "He's careful, yes. But he's not perfect. Over the years, I've seen things, heard things. I've already begun collecting some information quietly. It's not enough yet, but if we work together, we can find more. We can expose him." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe that they were now contemplating such a dangerous plan. Going up against Richard meant risking everything: her safety, Michael's life, and even the life of his mother. But what other choice did they have? Richard had stripped away any sense of control they had, and the longer they waited, the deeper they would sink into his web. "And what if he finds out what we're doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if he knows we're trying to expose him?" Michael's jaw tightened, the determination in his eyes hardening. "We'll be careful. We'll move slowly, and we'll be smart about it. But I can't promise you that he won't find out. The risk is real, Jessica. If Richard even suspects what we're up to, he'll come after us with everything he has." Jessica shuddered at the thought, imagining the full force of Richard's wrath descending upon them. She had seen firsthand how ruthless he could be, how easily he could destroy someone's life without a second thought. But as terrifying as that was, the thought of staying trapped under his control for the rest of her life was even worse. She looked into Michael's eyes, searching for reassurance, for a reason to believe that they could pull this off, and in his gaze she found it. Despite everything they had been through, despite the betrayals and the lies, she believed in him. She believed that together, they could fight back. "I'm in," Jessica said, her voice steadying as resolve took root in her chest. "I don't want to live like this anymore. Whatever it takes, I'm ready to bring him down." Michael exhaled, the weight of her words seeming to lift some of the tension from his shoulders. "We'll take it step by step. We'll need to find out where Richard is keeping his most valuable information. He has files, I know that much. Business records, personal dealings, there's a trail. And once we have enough, we can go to the authorities or leak it in a way that destroys his reputation. He'll have no choice but to back down." Jessica nodded, her mind already spinning with the enormity of the task ahead. It wouldn't be easy. Richard had spent years perfecting his hold over everyone around him. But for the first time, Jessica felt a flicker of hope that she could take control of her life again, that she could finally break free from the cage he had trapped her in. "What about your mother?" Jessica asked, her voice softening with concern. "If Richard finds out, he could hurt her, Michael. We can't let that happen." Michael's face darkened, a shadow of pain crossing his features. "I've been thinking about that too," he admitted. "I have some money saved up, enough to get her somewhere safe if we need to disappear quickly. It won't be easy, but we can't let her be used as leverage anymore." Jessica admired his strength and the fierce protectiveness he had for his mother. It was that same protectiveness that had kept him bound to Richard for so long. But now she saw the fire in him to break those chains once and for all. "And as she asked, her voice quiet but filled with emotion, what happens to us after all this?" Michael looked at her, his eyes softening. "I don't know," he said honestly. But what I do know is that I don't want to lose you, Jessica. I didn't plan on falling in love with you, but now that I have, I can't imagine walking away, not from you." Jessica felt her heart flutter at his words, a warmth spreading through her chest despite the fear that still lingered. "I don't want to lose you either, Michael," she whispered, "but we need to survive this first." He nodded, understanding the gravity of what lay ahead. "We will," he promised. "Together." Jessica stepped closer to him, closing the distance between them. For a moment she let herself feel the comfort of his presence, the strength of his arms as they wrapped around her. Despite the chaos swirling around them, there was a brief moment of peace in his embrace, a reminder that they still had each other. But as the night stretched on and the reality of their situation settled back in, Jessica knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be dangerous, and Richard wouldn't let go of his power easily. They would need to be careful, to outsmart him at every turn. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Jessica believed they could win. Together, they would find a way out of Richard's game, and when they did, they would finally be free. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as she clutched the folder, her hands trembling. The weight of her discovery pressed down on her, but now she was face to face with the man who had manipulated her entire life. Richard's eyes bore into her, cold and calculating as they always were. Yet there was something different in his gaze this time, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even fear at being caught off guard. "Richard," she began, her voice steadier than she expected, though her mind was racing. She knew she was standing on dangerous ground. "I know what you did. I know the truth about my father and what you took from him." Richard's jaw clenched, but he remained eerily calm, stepping further into the room and closing the door behind him with a soft click. His movements were deliberate, as if he were closing off her only escape, sealing her inside with his unrelenting presence. "You don't know anything," he said, his voice a sharp whisper, dripping with menace. "Whatever you think you found in those papers, you don't understand the full picture." Jessica's fingers tightened around the folder as she held her ground. She could feel the fear creeping up her spine, but she refused to let it consume her. "Not this time." "I understand enough," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "I know my father didn't betray you. You framed him, manipulated him, and stole from him. You've been using me this whole time, our marriage, everything just to keep up this twisted revenge." Richard's lips curled into a cold, cruel smile. "Do you think anyone will believe you? Do you think you can fight me, Jessica? I've been playing this game far longer than you realize." Jessica felt a surge of anger rises in her chest, a fire that drowned out the fear. She had been a pawn in Richard's game for too long, and now she had the proof that could bring it all crumbling down. "You're not untouchable, Richard. These documents, this is the proof. Everything you've done, all the lies, the manipulation, it's all in here." Richard's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he took another step toward her. "What are you going to do with that, Jessica? Run to the authorities. No one will care about an old business deal. They won't care about your father's misfortune. All they'll see is a woman scorned, desperately trying to take down her husband. You'll have nothing." For a brief moment, doubt crept into Jessica's mind. Richard's confidence was unnerving. His ability to twist any situation to his advantage was legendary. But then she thought of Michael, of the plan they had been building, of the people they could reach who would be willing to take Richard down. And she realized that Richard's power wasn't absolute, it was built on fear and secrecy. Without those, he was vulnerable. "I'm not alone in this," Jessica said, her voice filled with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." Richard's eyes darkened, his calm demeanor cracking slightly. "You should be," he said quietly, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. "You have no idea what I'm capable of, Jessica." But she didn't waver. For the first time, she saw Richard for what he truly was, a man who had built his empire on lies, control, and manipulation. And she knew that if she didn't fight back now, she would be trapped in his web forever. "I'm done living in fear," Jessica said, her voice unwavering. "I'm taking my life back." With that, she took a step toward the door, the folder still clutched tightly in her hands. Richard's gaze followed her, his expression unreadable, but she could sense the rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. As she reached for the doorknob, his voice stopped her. "If you leave this room with that folder, Jessica, you will regret it for the rest of your life." She paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob, but she didn't turn to face him. "The only thing I regret is trusting you." With those final words, she opened the door and walked out, her heart pounding in her chest, but her resolve stronger than ever. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face it. The mansion's long corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before her as she made her way back to Michael's room. Every step felt heavier than the last, but Jessica knew there was no turning back. She had crossed a line, and Richard wouldn't forget it. He would retaliate. Of that she was sure. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had Michael, and now they had the evidence to expose Richard for what he truly was. When she finally reached Michael's door, she knocked softly, her heart racing. A moment later, the door opened, and Michael stood before her, his expression filled with concern. "Jessica," he asked, his eyes scanning her face, sensing the urgency in her posture. "I found it," Jessica said, holding up the folder. "Everything we need to bring him down. It's all here." Michael's eyes widened as he took in the sight of the documents. He pulled her inside the room quickly, closing the door behind them. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, filled with worry. Jessica nodded, though she could still feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "He knows," she whispered. "Richard knows I've seen the files. He's going to come after us, Michael." Michael's expression hardened, his resolve matching her own. "Then we don't have much time. We need to move fast." Together, they sat at the small table in Michael's room, spreading out the documents and reviewing the contents. As they pored over the papers, Jessica felt a strange sense of relief. For so long, she had been lost in the darkness of Richard's control, but now she had a path forward, a way to fight back. Michael took a deep breath as he sat beside Jessica, his eyes filled with concern but also a growing resolve. He could see the exhaustion on her face, but behind it, there was a fire, a strength that had not been there before. Jessica had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and the weight of that decision hung in the air between them. "He'll retaliate," Michael said quietly, his voice steady but laced with the gravity of the situation. "Richard doesn't take kindly to being challenged, especially not like this. You've exposed his control, and now he's going to try and tighten his grip." Jessica nodded, her fingers running lightly over the edge of the folder, which now felt heavier than ever. "I know," she replied softly, "but I couldn't let him keep manipulating me. I've been living in fear for too long, and it's time I take control of my life." Michael reached out, gently placing his hand over hers. "You've already shown more courage than anyone who's ever stood up to him," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "But we have to be careful now. Richard is unpredictable, and he has more power than either of us fully understands." Jessica swallowed, her throat tight with emotion. "Do you think this is enough?" she asked, her voice wavering as she looked at the folder. "Do you think we can take him down?" Michael was silent for a moment, considering her question. He knew the magnitude of the task ahead and knew that going up against Richard would require more than just a few pieces of paper. But he also knew that Jessica's bravery had ignited something that could become much larger than the sum of its parts. "This is the first step," he said, his hand squeezing hers gently. "We need more information, more evidence. But this is the start of something that Richard can't control. He's built his empire on fear and secrets, but once those secrets start to unravel, he won't be able to stop it." Jessica leaned back, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. She felt the warmth, but it did little to soothe the storm raging inside her. "How did it come to this?" she whispered, more to herself than to Michael. "How did I let my life spiral into something so dark?" If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 4 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Michael's heart ached at the pain in her voice, but he knew there was no easy answer. "It's not your fault," he said softly. "Richard is a master manipulator. He plays with people's lives like they're chess pieces, but you're not his pawn anymore, Jessica. You're fighting back, and that's more than most people ever do." Jessica looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm scared, Michael," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of what he'll do next. I'm scared that I won't be strong enough to see this through." Michael's expression softened, and he reached up, gently cupping her face in his hand. "You're stronger than you know," he whispered. "You've already faced him head on. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this." Jessica closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the comfort of his touch. She had been carrying so much fear, so much pain for so long, but with Michael by her side, the weight felt a little more bearable. "I don't want to drag you into this any further," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Richard's already using you as part of his plan. I don't want him to hurt you because of me." Michael shook his head, his gaze fierce. I'm already in this, Jessica. There's no going back now. Richard's been using me for years, but not anymore. I'm not going to let him destroy us. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Jessica leaned into Michael's shoulder, her heart still heavy but bolstered by the quiet strength she drew from him. We need to figure out our next move, she said, pulling herself together. We can't just sit here and wait for him to strike. Michael nodded. I've been thinking about that. There are people in Richard's circle, business associates, partners who've been looking for an excuse to turn against him. If we can get to them, find out what they know, we might be able to build a case strong enough to take him down. But we have to be careful. We can't trust anyone fully. Jessica's mind raced, trying to process everything. How do we even begin? Who can we trust to help us? There's someone I know, Michael said, his voice thoughtful. Someone on the inside who has reason to hate Richard as much as we do. He's been biding his time, waiting for the right moment to act. If we can get him on our side, we might have a chance. Jessica looked at him, hope flickering in her chest. Do you trust him? Michael hesitated. As much as anyone can trust someone in Richard's world, but he has a score to settle, and that makes him dangerous to Richard, at least. Jessica nodded, understanding the risk. Then let's do it. We need all the allies we can get. Michael leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. We'll get through this, Jessica. I promise. As the fire continued to crackle, Jessica allowed herself to hope, even just for a moment. She had taken the first step toward freeing herself from Richard's control. And with Michael by her side, she was no longer walking that path alone. But in the back of her mind, she knew that this was only the beginning. The fight against Richard would be long and dangerous, and she had no illusions about the kind of man they were up against. He would stop at nothing to maintain his power, and now that she had challenged him, there was no telling what he might do. Still, for the first time in a long time, Jessica felt a flicker of power within herself. She wasn't the same woman who had been manipulated and used. She had strength, and with Michael by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. Michael cut her off, his eyes filled with a fierce protectiveness. Jessica, I've already put myself in danger. The moment I decided to stand by your side, I knew what I was getting into. I'm not going to let Richard win, not with you. Whatever happens, we're in this together. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, feeling the depth of his commitment. The weight of their situation pressed heavily on her, but knowing that Michael was willing to stand beside her, to fight this battle together, gave her a renewed sense of strength. Together she echoed softly, squeezing his hands. Despite the fear that gnawed at her, there was a flicker of hope that, for the first time, they might be able to outmaneuver Richard. Michael nodded, releasing her hands gently before pacing the room, thinking through the next steps. We need to tread carefully. Richard's not a man who forgives defiance, and now that he knows you've challenged him, he'll be watching both of us closely. We need to gather evidence quietly, but I'll need access to certain places he frequents. There's a club downtown where he meets with some of his overseas contacts. I've never been able to get inside, but now it's time to try. Jessica's mind was racing. If Richard finds out you're investigating him, he won't hesitate to act. I know, Michael replied grimly, stopping his pacing to face her, but we don't have a choice. We need to find out who this foreign contact is and what kind of deal they're involved in. If we can expose it, we might be able to weaken Richard's network from the outside. Jessica rose from her seat, her resolve hardening. I want to help. I can't sit here and wait for things to unfold. There must be something I can do. Michael hesitated, his protective instincts flaring, but he could see the determination in her eyes. There is, he admitted. Richard trusts you to a degree, even though he knows you've challenged him. If you can keep playing along, act like nothing's changed, he won't suspect you're gathering information. You have access to parts of his life I can't reach. Jessica's heart raced as she processed the magnitude of what he was asking. Deceiving Richard while living under his roof, under his constant scrutiny, was a dangerous game, but she had already crossed the point of no return. I'll do whatever it takes, she said firmly. I can handle it. Michael looked at her, admiration in his eyes. You're stronger than you know, he said quietly, but we need to be careful. Every move counts. Just then, a sharp knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Both of them froze, their gazes locked as the tension in the room heightened. Jessica, are you in there? Richard's cold voice echoed from the hallway. The knock came again, this time harder. Jessica's blood ran cold. She exchanged a quick glance with Michael, her heart hammering in her chest. Richard's presence was always unnerving, but now, with their newfound plan in motion, the stakes were higher than ever. Michael mouthed the word calm and Jessica took a steadying breath. She moved toward the door, her movement slow and deliberate, before opening it just enough to face Richard. "Yes, I'm here," she said, her voice steady, though her pulse was racing. She met Richard's piercing gaze, her face carefully neutral. Richard's eyes flickered with suspicion as they darted between her and the slightly ajar door. "What are you doing in here?" Jessica forced a small smile. "I was just thinking," needed a moment alone. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "It seems like you've had a lot on your mind lately. It's important to know where your loyalties lie, Jessica. Don't forget that." The warning in his tone was unmistakable. He was testing her, and both of them knew it. "I haven't forgotten," she replied smoothly, keeping her tone light. Richard studied her for a long moment, as though trying to read the secrets beneath her calm exterior. "Good," he said, his voice dripping with authority, "because now's not the time for disobedience." With that, he turned and left, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hall. Jessica stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched him disappear. She closed the door carefully, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Michael, who had remained hidden just out of view, stepped forward, his face filled with concern. "That was too close." Jessica nodded, still shaken. "He's suspicious. We have to be more careful." Michael reached out, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "We will be," he murmured. "But this only means we're getting closer." Richard's feeling the pressure. "We just need to keep pushing." Jessica leaned into him, the warmth of his embrace momentarily calming her nerves. She knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but with Michael by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. They had crossed a line with Richard, and there was no going back now. The game had begun, and every move from this point forward could be their last. But Jessica knew one thing for certain: she was no longer the woman who would cower before Richard's control. She would fight for her freedom. And with Michael's help, she would find a way to bring Richard's empire crashing down. As they stood together in the quiet room, the weight of their alliance settled between them. They were on the edge of something dangerous, something powerful. And though the path ahead was uncertain, Jessica knew she wouldn't face it alone. Michael interrupted her, stepping closer with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat, his hand gently brushing her cheek, as if to shield her from the storm they both knew was coming. "I won't let anything happen to you, Jessica. We fought too hard, bled too much, to turn back now." The warmth of his hand stirred something deep within her comfort. Yes, but also a painful reminder of how fragile their lives had become, how close they were to the edge of disaster. Her pulse quickened with the fear she tried so desperately to bury, the gnawing dread that if they misstepped, everything would collapse in a heartbeat. Michael leaned in closer, his lips grazing hers in a fleeting kiss, a kiss that held 1,000 unsaid promises. For just a moment, Jessica allowed herself to melt into the connection, to grasp onto the one thing that still felt real in a world unraveling around them. She clung to it because deep down, she knew that it was this fragile bond that might be the only thing keeping her from drowning in the chaos. When they finally pulled apart, Michael's eyes locked onto hers with a ferocity that made her breath hitch. "If we play our cards right, we can destroy him," he said, his voice low, but the conviction behind it thundered in her ears. And then, without another word, he left, leaving her standing there, her mind swirling with thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her. Fear was clawing at her insides, but Jessica couldn't let it win. She wasn't the same timid woman who had entered this marriage. She had been hardened by betrayal, shaped by the fire of survival. Now was the time to be cunning, to outsmart Richard at his own twisted game. The road ahead was treacherous, but she would not falter. She wouldn't let him crush her spirit. That night, before retreating to her room, Jessica took the folder with the evidence she had painstakingly uncovered and hid it away, knowing this was just the beginning. The first shot had been fired. Now, it was a waiting game, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. As days passed, the tension in the mansion grew unbearable. Every glance from the servants felt heavy with suspicion. Every whispered word a potential threat. Since the confrontation in Richard's office, the air had shifted. She could feel his presence lurking like a predator ready to pounce, waiting for the right moment to retaliate. Richard was never one to let a challenge go unanswered, and Jessica knew that danger was coiled, ready to strike. Michael felt it too, but they kept up the charade. Outwardly, they moved through their days as if nothing had changed. But behind closed doors, the walls were closing in, and Michael's investigation grew more desperate. The key to bringing Richard down was hidden in his shadowy international connections, the power behind his empire. One afternoon, as Jessica wandered through the garden, attempting to soothe her frazzled nerves, Michael approached her quietly. The autumn chill had already begun to wither the flowers, much like the hope inside her. He stood by her side, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jessica, I've found something." Her heart raced, torn between relief and terror. Whatever he had discovered could change everything for better or worse. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady, though inside she was trembling. Michael led her to a secluded corner of the garden, the weight of his discovery pressing on them both. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, his eyes dark with the gravity of what he held. Jessica opened it with shaking hands, revealing a grainy photo of a man she didn't recognize and several newspaper clippings from across the globe. "Victor Drager," Michael whispered, the name sending a chill down her spine. "He's a Bulgarian businessman, but beneath that, he's involved in arms trafficking, money laundering, and other crimes. He's Richard's lifeline, his secret weapon. Without him, Richard's empire crumbles." Jessica stared at the photo, trying to comprehend the enormity of what Michael had just laid before her. This man, this shadowy figure, was the key to unraveling Richard's stranglehold on their lives. If they could expose him, they wouldn't just hurt Richard, they would destroy him. Her mind raced, piecing together a plan from the scattered fragments of hope and fear. "How do we bring him down?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do we do it without Richard finding out?" Michael's jaw tightened. "Victor is coming to Spain soon for a meeting with Richard. If we can intercept and capture proof of their dealings, we can expose them both." Jessica's heart pounded. The thought of standing so close to the two men who had the power to destroy her filled her with dread, but there was no turning back now. "It's dangerous," she murmured, almost to herself, the weight of the risk settling over her like a suffocating shroud. "I know," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze never leaving hers. The weight of his words hung between them, heavy and inescapable. "But we can't stop now, Jessica. If we let this slip away, if we falter for even a moment, Richard will grow stronger. He'll tighten his grip around us, and when he does, he won't just squeeze us out, he'll crush us." Jessica's heart pounded in her chest. As his words sank in, she felt the gravity of their situation press down on her, suffocating, but also awakening something inside. It was fear, yes, but also a fierce, stubborn determination. They had come too far, suffered too much, to turn back now. The stakes were life and death, freedom and captivity, and there was no middle ground. Either they brought Richard down, or they would be consumed by his dark, merciless empire. "Do you know when and where?" she asked, her voice steady, though the storm of emotions churned just beneath the surface. Every part of her knew they were on the edge of something monumental, something dangerous, but they had to see it through. Michael nodded, his expression dark. "It's a private villa on the outskirts of the city. One of my contacts managed to intercept information. Victor will arrive in secret, late at night, avoiding all attention. The meeting with Richard will be behind closed doors, tight security, no witnesses, no mistakes." His voice was low, each word underscored with the danger that awaited them. "Getting in will be nearly impossible, but it's the only chance we've got." The mention of Victor Drager sent a chill through Jessica. This man, this shadowy figure she had never met, held in his hands the power to topple Richard's empire or to obliterate them entirely. She had read enough about him, heard whispers of his ruthless dealings, his empire built on the backs of corruption and blood. He was no mere businessman, he was the invisible hand behind the scenes, pulling the strings that allowed men like Richard to thrive unchecked. Jessica took a deep breath, feeling the crushing weight of the situation. They were no longer just fighting Richard, they were up against something far more sinister, a global network of crime and power. But if they could pull this off, if they could expose Victor and his dealings with Richard, they wouldn't just hurt Richard, they would destroy him, dismantling the very foundation on which his empire stood. "We'll do it," she said finally, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable resolve. Fear still flickered at the edges of her mind, but she pushed it away, allowing only the fire of determination to remain. "We have to." Michael stared at her, a look of surprise crossing his face. He had expected resistance, hesitation, but what he saw now was something else entirely. Jessica had always been strong, but this was different. She was no longer afraid of Richard, afraid of the darkness that had once threatened to engulf her. She had been pushed to the edge, and instead of crumbling, she had found her strength. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 5 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. "We'll do it," he repeated, his voice filled with the same conviction. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. In that moment, it wasn't just a touch, it was a promise that they were in this together, that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. In the days that followed, Michael threw himself into preparing the plan. Every detail had to be perfect, every move calculated. They couldn't afford a single misstep. He reached out to his contacts, allies hidden in the shadows, people who had once been loyal to Richard but had grown disillusioned with his brutal reign. These were men and women who had seen too much, who had lost too much. They were willing to help, but only if they believed the plan could work, only if they thought there was a real chance to bring Richard down. Jessica, meanwhile, tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy within the mansion, though it felt like the walls were closing in on her with each passing day. The air was thick with tension. She could feel it in the eyes of the servants, in the way they spoke in hushed tones whenever she passed. They sensed it too, the undercurrent of fear that had taken root since the confrontation in Richard's office. Richard himself was a looming presence, a shadow that seemed to follow her everywhere. His once casual words had taken on a more sinister tone, each conversation dripping with veiled threats. He knew she was up to something. He could feel the shift in power, the slow unraveling of control. But he wasn't acting yet. No, Richard was a predator, circling his prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One evening, as Jessica sat alone in her room, poring over her father's documents, she heard a noise behind her. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she turned sharply. There, standing in the doorway, was Richard. His tall figure was shrouded in the dim light, his face half hidden in shadow, but the menace in his presence was palpable. "You've been quite active lately," Richard said softly, his voice as smooth as silk but with a razor's edge. There was a dangerous glint in his eyes, a threat disguised as an observation. Jessica's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. Slowly, she closed the folder in front of her, laying it down with deliberate care, masking the storm brewing inside her. "Just some old family papers," she replied evenly, her voice betraying none of the anxiety she felt. Richard stepped further into the room, his every movement calculated, predatory. "You know, Jessica, I've noticed you've been taking certain liberties," he murmured, his tone dripping with warning. "Liberties that could cost you dearly." Jessica's pulse quickened, but she refused to let him see her fear. She stood up straighter, meeting his gaze with a defiance she hadn't allowed herself to show before. "You've been playing with my life for years, Richard," she said, her voice cold and steady. "But you don't control me anymore. I'm not the woman you married. I have something now, something that can destroy you, and you know it." Richard's eyes darkened, and for a moment the air between them crackled with tension. His expression was unreadable, his mind calculating, always 2 steps ahead. But for the first time, Jessica saw something flicker across his face, something that looked like uncertainty. Without another word, Richard turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, heart pounding in her chest. The door clicked shut behind him, but the silence that followed was anything but peaceful. Jessica knew then, in that moment, that the war between them had escalated to a point of no return. In the days that followed, the preparations became more urgent. The villa on the outskirts of the city loomed in the distance, a fortress shrouded in secrecy, where the meeting would take place. Michael had gathered every bit of information he could, but the risks were staggering. If they were caught, there would be no mercy. Victor Drager was a man who operated without fear, without compassion. And Richard was desperate, a man backed into a corner. Desperate men were the most dangerous. The night of the meeting approached quickly, and the tension mounted. Jessica could feel it, a tight knot of anxiety twisting inside her. But alongside it was something else, something stronger, a fierce determination, a resolve to see this through, no matter the cost. They were stepping into the lion's den, but they weren't walking in blindly. They had a plan. They had each other. And for the first time in a long time, Jessica felt a flicker of hope. Jessica's pulse quickened as she stood next to Michael, hidden among the thick bushes and undergrowth that shielded them from view. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the sprawling villa before them. The tension between them was palpable, a shared understanding that they were about to risk everything they had fought so hard to protect. But beneath that tension, there was a steely determination, a mutual resolve to see this through, no matter the cost. "That's it," Michael whispered, nodding toward the imposing villa in the distance. Jessica nodded in return, her eyes fixed on the building. From their vantage point, it looked deceptively quiet, as though the house was asleep. But she knew better. Behind those walls, danger lurked. The villa was crawling with security, each guard trained to spot intruders like them. This meeting between Richard and Victor Drager was the golden opportunity. They had been waiting for evidence that could bring Richard's entire empire crashing down. But to get it, they had to enter a fortress. "Are we sure Victor's already inside?" Jessica asked, her voice hushed as she kept her gaze locked on the house, every fiber of her being on high alert. Michael checked his watch, his face a mix of nerves and grim confidence. "He's inside. My contact said he arrived this morning, quiet and under the radar. Everything should be in place. We wait for the meeting to start, and then we move." Jessica nodded, feeling the weight of the plan settle over her like a heavy cloak. This was the moment they had been working toward for months. One mistake, one wrong move, and everything would unravel. Richard would not forgive betrayal, and Victor, he was a man known for erasing his enemies without a trace. The stakes had never been higher, and yet here they were, standing on the precipice of something dangerous and deadly. "How do you plan to get us inside?" she asked, glancing over at Michael, trying to quell the fear rising within her. Michael flashed a tight, almost nervous smile. "I've got a friend in security," he said, pulling a small magnetic card from his pocket. "One of Richard's men. He owes me a favor. This card gives us access to the back entrance. Once inside, we'll hack into the surveillance system and disable the cameras for just long enough to slip through unnoticed." Jessica stared at the card in his hand, her heart hammering in her chest. This entire mission hinged on Michael's ability to shut down the cameras, even for a few moments. If they failed, they would be caught before they could even step foot inside. "Okay," Jessica said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do it." And as the final rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, casting the villa into shadows, Michael led them along the perimeter of the property. He moved with calculated precision, his steps quiet and deliberate as they avoided the patrols. Jessica followed closely behind, each step feeling heavier than the last, her senses heightened with the weight of what was to come. They reached the back of the villa, where a small door was nestled discreetly into the side of the building, hidden from view by thick ivy. Michael glanced around, ensuring no one was watching, and then swiftly swiped the magnetic card through the reader. For a moment there was nothing but silence, and Jessica held her breath. Then, with a soft click, the door unlocked. "Let's go," Michael whispered, slipping inside with Jessica following close behind. She quietly shut the door behind them, sealing their entry. The villa's interior was as cold and calculating as the man who owned it. The opulence did nothing to soften the air of menace that seemed to hang in every corner. Everything here was designed for power and control, much like Richard himself. But tonight this space would serve as the stage for his downfall. Michael led them through a series of narrow hallways, each one deserted but lined with security cameras. They reached a small control room, the nerve center for the villa's surveillance. Monitors lined the walls, showing live feeds from every corner of the property. Michael wasted no time. He slid the card through the system's access panel and began typing rapidly into the console. Jessica stood by the door, her eyes darting down the hallway as she listened for any sign of approaching footsteps. The minutes stretched out in agonizing silence until finally Michael spoke. "Done," he murmured, his fingers still dancing across the keyboard. "I've disabled the cameras in the East Wing, where the meeting is taking place. We've got about 5 minutes before someone notices the feed has been tampered with." 5 minutes, Jessica's heart pounded even harder. It wasn't much time, but it was all they had. They slipped out of the control room and made their way to the East Wing. Every second felt like an eternity as they hurried down the corridors, their footsteps eerily quiet in the stillness of the mansion. As they neared the door to the meeting room, Jessica could hear voices muffled but distinct. She motioned for Michael to stop, and they crouched beside the door, listening intently. Richard's voice was unmistakable, that cold, commanding tone she had come to know all too well. But it was the other voice, low and menacing, that sent a chill down her spine. Victor Drager. They were discussing something big, an arms smuggling network that spanned countries, a criminal empire that stretched beyond anything Jessica had imagined. "Do you have it?" Michael whispered, his voice urgent as he glanced at her. Jessica nodded, her hand shaking slightly as she pulled out her phone and began recording. The conversation inside was a damning admission of their crimes: smuggling, bribery, corruption at every level. Richard spoke of a major shipment coming in the next few weeks, and Victor laughed coldly, assuring him that everything was in place, that no one would ever trace it back to them. Each word was more incriminating than the last, and Jessica knew they had exactly what they needed. This recording could expose them both, destroy Richard's empire, and implicate Victor on an international scale, but they were running out of time. Her heart raced as she continued to record, trying to capture every detail, but they couldn't stay much longer. If they were caught, the consequences would be deadly. "We need to go," Michael whispered urgently, glancing at his watch. Now. Jessica gave one final look at the door, the voices behind it still murmuring of their grand plans, oblivious to the betrayal just outside. Then, clutching her phone tightly, she nodded to Michael. They slipped back down the hall, moving quickly but carefully, knowing that every second brought them closer to being discovered. The adrenaline coursed through Jessica's veins as they retraced their steps, heading for the exit. They had what they came for. Now all that remained was to escape alive. Suddenly, a metallic clatter echoed ominously behind them. Jessica and Michael whipped around, their hearts thudding in unison as they came face to face with a security guard standing mere feet away. His initial expression of shock quickly morphed into one of cold suspicion. Time seemed to freeze for a second, the air between them thick with tension. Then, before the guard could react, Michael moved like lightning. He lunged forward, slamming the guard against the wall with such force that the man's head snapped back in surprise. "Go," Michael hissed at Jessica, his voice urgent and strained. "Finish recording and get out of here." For a heartbeat, Jessica hesitated, torn between the instinct to help and the knowledge that the mission rested on her escape. She swallowed hard, realizing that Michael could hold off the guard for now, but if they didn't secure the evidence, everything would be lost. Without a word, she bolted toward the meeting room, her feet barely making a sound as she slid her phone under the door and resumed recording. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she forced herself to stay calm as she captured the final moments of the damning conversation between Richard and Victor. Then behind her came the sound she dreaded, a shout, sharp and urgent. The guard had recovered and was calling for backup. The villa erupted into chaos as alarms blared, shattering the quiet of the night. Jessica felt her heart lurch, but there was no time for fear. She grabbed the phone and sprinted down the hallway, her legs pumping as adrenaline surged through her veins. She could hear the pounding footsteps of more guards approaching fast, their radios crackling with orders. The situation was spiraling out of control, but she couldn't afford to think about it now. All that mattered was getting out alive, and with the evidence intact. Jessica reached the back door and threw it open, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. She didn't stop running until she reached the designated safe spot Michael had scouted earlier, hidden behind a thick wall of trees. She bent over, gasping for breath, clutching the phone tightly in her hand. Her chest heaved, but mingled with her fear was the sharp, thrilling taste of victory. They had done it. They had the proof. Minutes later, Michael appeared, breathless but alive. His face was flushed, his hair disheveled, but he wore the grim look of someone who had narrowly escaped death. He slid down beside her, both of them watching the villa in the distance as the alarms continued to blare, guards running frantically to contain the breach. "We did it," Michael muttered between deep breaths, his eyes wide with disbelief at their escape. Jessica nodded, still trying to calm her pounding heart. She held up the phone, the weight of what they had achieved sinking in. "We have what we need," she said quietly, though her voice shook with the enormity of their task. The evidence was there, irrefutable proof of Richard and Victor's crimes, but now the real danger began. They had exposed the truth, but they had also painted a target on their backs. Back at the mansion, the familiar coldness of the place felt even more suffocating. Jessica sat in the living room, her fingers gripping the phone tightly, as if afraid it might disappear. The recording on it was their lifeline, evidence that could topple Richard's empire and bring him to his knees. Yet, holding that power came with a price. The walls seemed to close in on her, the weight of the mansion's history of manipulation and deceit bearing down on her. Michael entered the room, his face clouded with concern. The adrenaline of their escape had faded, leaving them both on edge, knowing the next steps would be crucial. "We don't have much time," he said, sitting down beside her. His voice was low, his words laced with urgency. "Richard knows someone was there, He'll put it together soon, and when he does, he'll come after us with everything he has." Jessica swallowed hard, feeling the crushing weight of their situation. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at the edge of a precipice, one wrong move away from plunging into chaos. "We have the evidence," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But if Richard finds out we have it before we act, he'll destroy us." Michael leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the phone in her hands. "We can't go to the police," he said, his voice filled with the hard truth they both knew. "Richard has too many people in his pocket. They'll cover for him, erase the evidence, and we'll be left with nothing. Worse will be the ones who disappear." Jessica's mind raced, trying to think of an alternative. Every option seemed to lead to a dead end. They were fighting a man who wielded power like a weapon, a man who would stop at nothing to protect his empire. "We need allies," she said finally, her voice firmer now. "People who want Richard gone but have the influence to help us take him down." Michael nodded slowly, the wheels in his mind already turning. "There are a few businessmen and politicians who've been burned by Richard in the past," he said thoughtfully. "If we can convince them that we have the means to bring him down, they might back us. But it's a huge risk. We're not just asking them to go up against Richard, we're asking them to risk everything." Jessica stared at the phone again, feeling the noose tightening around them. "How long do you think we have before Richard realizes it was us?" she asked quietly. "Not long," Michael admitted, his face grim. "He's probably already piecing it together. We've got maybe a few days at most before he starts making moves. But we can't wait for that. We have to act now before he destroys us." Jessica nodded, the weight of their situation pressing down on her. Time was running out, and they were playing a deadly game against a man who had everything to lose. But they had the evidence, and that gave them an edge for now. The only question was whether they could use it before it was too late. In the days that followed, Michael and Jessica moved with calculated precision, navigating the shadows of their dangerous game. Every step they took, every call they made was shrouded in secrecy. They couldn't afford to make a single misstep, not when Richard was likely watching their every move. They contacted only those who had a vested interest in Richard's downfall, former allies turned enemies, people whose lives he had ruined. Each meeting was planned meticulously, conducted with the utmost caution. One wrong word, one slip up, and Richard's wrath would come crashing down on them. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 6 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. One of the first to respond was William Aguilar, a shrewd businessman who had once partnered with Richard before falling victim to his ruthless ambition. Years ago, Richard had orchestrated a fraudulent deal that had cost William a significant part of his fortune, leaving him ruined and humiliated. Since then, William had harbored a deep grudge, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. "If what you're telling me is true," William said during a clandestine meeting in a dimly lit, private corner of an old club, "this could be the blow we've all been waiting for." Michael and Jessica exchanged a glance before Jessica pulled out her phone, showing William a portion of the recording. William leaned in, his face tightening with focus as he watched the screen. His eyes darkened, his jaw clenched, and slowly, his expression shifted from curiosity to something far more dangerous, a mix of satisfaction and pure, seething rage. "This is it," he said, almost to himself, his voice low but filled with barely contained fury. "This is the proof we need. That smug bastard has been hiding behind his respectable businessman act for too long. If this goes public, it'll destroy him." Jessica's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her voice calm, knowing that every word mattered. "Do you have contacts in the media?" she asked, hoping the plan was finally falling into place. William's lips curled into a cold smile. "I have friends who would love nothing more than to watch Richard burn. I can make sure this reaches the right hands. Once the story breaks, it'll spread like wildfire. Richard won't recover from this." Relief washed over Jessica, but it was mixed with a gnawing anxiety. The plan was progressing, but they were far from safe. They had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. "How soon can you make this happen?" Michael asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. William rubbed his chin thoughtfully, considering the logistics. "Not long. Give me the full recording, and I can get it into the press in a matter of days. But you need to understand, once this goes public, Richard will know it was you. He'll come for you with everything he's got. There will be no going back." Jessica looked at Michael, feeling the weight of William's words settle heavily over them. The moment the evidence was released, their world would be turned upside down. Richard would stop at nothing to hunt them down, but they had come too far to back down now. The fear that had once gripped her was replaced with an unwavering determination. "We're ready," Jessica said firmly, her gaze locking with Michael's. "We can't keep living in fear under his control. This is our only chance. We have to take it." Michael nodded, the same fire in his eyes. They had no other choice. In the days that followed, everything moved faster than they had anticipated. William worked his connections, pushing the story through the right channels, feeding the media snippets of information, enough to ignite a storm of speculation around Richard's dealings. Word spread quickly, and soon the story was everywhere headline news, a scandal that rocked the foundation of Richard's empire. Then it happened. Jessica sat in the mansion's living room, her hands clasped tightly around her phone as the news broadcast played on the television. The headline scrolled across the screen, detailing Richard's involvement with international arms smuggling, his connection to Victor Drager, and the illegal operations that had propped up his empire for years. The evidence was out there now, undeniable and damning. As she watched the coverage, a sense of both triumph and dread filled her. They had won, but the cost had been enormous. The front door burst open and Richard stormed into the room, his face contorted with rage. He had clearly just seen the news, his world crumbling around him. His once impenetrable empire, built on lies and deceit, was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "You," he spat, his voice venomous as he advanced toward Jessica. "You think you can do this to me? You think you can ruin me?" Jessica stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, but her face calm, resolute. "It's over, Richard. You can't hide anymore. The world knows who you really are." Richard's eyes were wild with fury, and in one final desperate act, he lunged toward her, his body trembling with rage. But before he could take another step, the unmistakable wail of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached the mansion. Richard froze, his expression shifting from fury to panic as the realization hit him. "It's the police," Jessica said, her voice steady, though inside she felt a mix of emotions she couldn't quite define. Relief, yes, but also sadness. "They're here for you." Richard's face drained of color. He knew it was over. The years he had spent building his empire, the countless lives he had ruined, all of it had come crashing down. And now, with the sirens blaring outside, there was nothing left for him but the cold reality of his defeat. As the police arrived, storming into the mansion, Jessica watched silently, her heart heavy. She had won, but the victory felt bittersweet. Richard, the man who had once controlled every aspect of her life, was finally finished, but the cost of that victory had been high. She had lost pieces of herself in the fight, pieces she wasn't sure she could ever recover. Michael stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "We did it," he said softly. Jessica nodded, her gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before her. "Yes," she whispered, "but now we have to figure out how to rebuild from the ashes." As the officers led Richard out of the mansion in handcuffs, his once fearsome presence had evaporated. His eyes, once filled with fury and arrogance, were now hollow, as though the man who had caused so much pain had already resigned to his fate. Jessica stood in the doorway, watching silently as they took him away, her emotions swirling inside her like a storm slowly dissipating. For so long, Richard had been a dark force in her life, and now he was gone. But the weight of everything she had endured still clung to her, heavy and suffocating. Michael stepped beside her, his hand gently closing around hers. "We did it," he whispered, his voice filled with relief and pride, though a hint of concern lingered in his eyes as he looked at her. Jessica nodded, exhaling slowly. "Yes," she said softly, feeling the enormity of the moment. "We did it. The battle had been won, but the victory felt bittersweet." As Richard disappeared from view, Jessica knew that while the storm had passed, the path ahead, one of rebuilding, healing, and rediscovering herself, was just beginning. The sirens faded into the distance, and Jessica collapsed onto the living room couch, her body finally succumbing to the exhaustion that had been building for days. The relentless tension that had gripped her was beginning to loosen, but it left her feeling disoriented. Richard was gone, his empire destroyed, the scandal all over the news. But the emptiness that followed left her unsure of what came next. Michael sat down beside her, watching her carefully. The relief of their success was tempered by the understanding that Jessica had been through a tremendous ordeal. He gently took her hand, his touch grounding her in the present. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. Jessica looked down at their intertwined hands, feeling a mix of emotions that she couldn't easily name. "I thought I'd feel free," she whispered, "but now that it's over, I don't know what to feel. There's this emptiness, this void. I'm not sure what comes next." Michael's eyes softened with understanding. "That's normal," he said gently. "You've been fighting so hard for so long, and now that it's over, it's going to take time. What matters is that you're free to decide how to move forward. You're in control now." Jessica absorbed his words, realizing the truth in them. For years, Richard had dictated every part of her life. Now, with him gone, she had choices. But the process of reclaiming her life wasn't going to be as simple as she had imagined. The scars Richard had left behind ran deep, and healing them would take time. "Thank you," she said quietly, turning to Michael, gratitude welling up inside her. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Michael gave her a soft smile, squeezing her hand. "You don't have to do it alone," he reassured her. "I'll be here for as long as you need me." For the first time in what felt like forever, Jessica felt a sense of warmth and security. The road ahead was uncertain, but she didn't have to face it by herself. She wasn't alone anymore. In the days that followed, the world outside Jessica's mansion was buzzing with news of Richard's downfall. The scandal consumed the media, with every detail of his illegal dealings and connections to Victor Drager being dissected. More and more revelations about Richard's crimes surfaced, and his former associates distanced themselves from him, leaving him to face the consequences alone. But Jessica chose to remain out of the spotlight. With Michael and William's help, her involvement in the takedown remained hidden. She didn't want to be the center of attention, didn't want to be seen as either the victim or the heroine. She wanted peace, and that meant stepping away from the chaos and the life she had once been trapped in. The mansion, once a symbol of Richard's power and control, now felt like a hollow, empty shell. The luxury it held had always been tainted by the darkness of Richard's manipulations, and now that he was gone, it was nothing but a reminder of the life she wanted to leave behind. Jessica spent hours walking through the mansion, through its vast, silent halls, realizing that it no longer had a place in her future. One morning, while walking through the garden once beautiful, now overgrown and neglected, Jessica made a decision. She couldn't stay here, surrounded by memories of her past. The mansion, for all its grandeur, had become a prison, and she was ready to leave it behind. That same afternoon, she met with a real estate agent. It was time to sell the property and use the money to start anew. Selling the mansion was more than just a financial decision. It was symbolic. It represented the final break from Richard's hold over her life, the last piece of the past she needed to let go of. A week later, Jessica and Michael stood in front of a small house in a quiet coastal town, far from the noise of the city and the haunting memories of the mansion. It was a simple place, peaceful and serene, with the sound of the ocean in the distance. Michael had suggested the town as a temporary refuge, a place where Jessica could heal and rebuild, away from the shadows of her past. "This feels right," Jessica said, looking at the house, feeling a calmness she hadn't experienced in years. Michael smiled, his hand resting gently on her back. "It's a fresh start," he said, his voice warm. "A place where you can figure out what you want, without the weight of the past holding you down." Jessica nodded, feeling the first flickers of hope. The battle was over, and though the wounds would take time to heal, she knew she was finally on the path to reclaiming her life. With Michael by her side and the endless horizon of the sea stretching out before her, she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she could begin again. "It's simple, but I think it'll be perfect for you," Michael said, his voice filled with warmth as they stood in front of the small house. The gentle sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. "Here, you can finally have the peace you need." Jessica turned to look at him, feeling a sense of relief she hadn't experienced in years. After so long being trapped in Richard's manipulation, constantly living in fear and uncertainty, she had forgotten what freedom truly felt like. The sea breeze lifted the weight that had settled on her chest for so long, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she allowed herself to exhale. "It's perfect," she whispered, a genuine smile spreading across her face as she gazed out at the endless horizon, the sun glistening off the water like a promise of a new beginning. Michael smiled too, watching her closely. He could see the transformation starting in her, the slow unraveling of all the pain and fear that had once bound her. "And what comes next?" he asked, stepping closer, his tone filled with gentle curiosity. Jessica took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the horizon. For so long, her future had been dictated by others, particularly by Richard and his manipulative schemes. But now, Now she stood at the edge of possibility with no one to control her, no shadow looming over her decisions. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice soft but steady, "but I think that's the exciting part. For the first time in years, my future is mine. I can build it however I want." Michael nodded, understanding the magnitude of her words. They had both fought so hard to get to this moment, and while challenges still lay ahead, they knew that together they could face anything. "We'll build it together," he said, taking her hand with a reassuring squeeze. Jessica turned to him, her heart swelling with gratitude and hope. She had spent so many years isolated, emotionally caged by Richard's control, but now she was free, and she wasn't facing that freedom alone. With Michael by her side, she knew she had the strength to rebuild her life. "Yes, we will," she replied, her smile growing as a sense of peace settled over her. As the sun began to set, casting shades of gold and crimson across the sky, Jessica and Michael stood in silence, watching as the day slowly faded into night. The cool breeze swept through the air, and for the first time in a long time, Jessica felt the quiet joy of simply being present in the moment. No more fear, no more manipulation. Her life was her own, and the world beyond the horizon was full of possibilities. In the days that followed, the coastal house became Jessica's sanctuary. The sound of the waves, the salty air, and the simplicity of her new surroundings were healing her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Though the memories of Richard's betrayal lingered, they no longer held power over her. With each sunrise, Jessica felt the weight of her past gradually lift, replaced by the quiet comfort of a life she was rebuilding from the ground up. Michael, too, found peace in the tranquil town. Together, they walked along the beach, discussing their future, no longer bound by the shadows of what had been. The past was still there, but it no longer dictated their lives. They had fought hard to reach this moment, and now they were learning to live in the present. One morning, while Jessica was rearranging the few pieces of furniture they had in the house, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Emily's name. Jessica hadn't spoken to her younger sister in a long time. Their relationship had become strained, especially after Jessica became embroiled in her battle against Richard. Emily had always been a reminder of the sacrifices Jessica had made to protect her, and the emotional distance between them had been painful. "Emily," Jessica answered cautiously, her voice betraying the nervousness she felt. Emily's voice was soft on the other end, but there was a seriousness to her tone. "I've been following the news about Richard and everything that's happened." Jessica remained silent for a moment, feeling the weight of the past creeping back into the moment. "Yes," she finally replied. "It's been complicated, but I'm starting over." There was a pause on the other end before Emily spoke again. "I'm glad you're doing better. But there's something I need to tell you." A knot formed in Jessica's stomach. Her relationship with Emily had been fraught for so long, and now, after everything that had happened, this conversation felt like it could open old wounds. "What is it?" she asked, her voice careful. "It's about Dad," Emily said, her voice lowering. "There's something I discovered about him. Something I never told you when you were with Richard. I always thought you knew, but now I realize maybe you didn't." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 7 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Jessica's heart began to race. The topic of their father had always been difficult. Richard had twisted Jessica's memories of him, poisoning her perception of the man she had once loved. "What did you find?" Jessica asked, her voice tense with anticipation. Emily's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Dad never wanted to betray you or get involved with Richard. It was Richard's manipulation all along. He forced Dad into business with him, blackmailing and threatening him. I found proof when I was going through some old family documents. Richard cornered Dad and made it seem like he was complicit, but he wasn't. He was trying to protect you, Jessica. He couldn't get away." Jessica's world seemed to stop for a moment. All these years, she had believed that her father had willingly been part of Richard's dark web, that his death had been a consequence of his poor choices. But now, hearing Emily's words, everything she thought she knew about her father's role was unraveling. It was yet another cruel twist in Richard's manipulative games. "Are you sure?" Jessica asked, her voice shaking as she tried to process this new information. "Yes," Emily replied firmly. "I found letters he wrote, begging Richard to let him out. But Richard used you as leverage. He trapped Dad, just like he trapped you." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. The betrayal she had felt for so long toward her father was suddenly replaced by a deep sadness. Richard had not only manipulated her life but had stolen the truth about her father's intentions. The realization hit her like a wave. Her father had been a victim, just like she had. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "I didn't know." "I thought you did," Emily said, her voice soft with empathy. "But now you can know the truth. Dad loved you, Jessica. He never wanted this." Jessica stood there, the phone pressed to her ear, overwhelmed by emotion she hadn't expected. Her father had tried to protect her, had fought for her in ways she hadn't known. It was yet another piece of her past that needed healing. Jessica's resolve was strengthened by the weight of the truth and Michael's unwavering support. She knew that revealing her father's story and clearing his name would be a monumental task, but it was one she felt compelled to undertake. As they continued their walk along the beach, Jessica began to make a plan. "I need to start by reviewing all the documents Emily sent me. I'll need to verify everything and find a way to present it so that it reaches those who need to hear it. I want the truth to be known, not just to clear my father's name, but to ensure that Richard's manipulations are fully exposed." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "We can start by reaching out to investigative journalists or legal experts who might help in making the information public. It might also be worth considering a personal statement or even a public campaign, depending on how you want to frame it." Jessica agreed. "That's a good idea. I'll need to think carefully about the best way to present this information to make the biggest impact. I want to make sure that my father's side of the story is heard and understood." They spent the next few days organizing the documents, cross-referencing the letters with available evidence, and brainstorming strategies for publicizing the truth. Jessica found solace in the process, knowing she was taking concrete steps towards justice. The day the documents were finalized, Jessica and Michael met with a respected investigative journalist who had a reputation for handling sensitive cases with integrity. The journalist was intrigued by Jessica's story and agreed to help her bring the truth to light. As the story began to take shape, Jessica felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The process of clearing her father's name and exposing Richard's true nature was demanding, but it was also empowering. Each step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of her past and her family's legacy. While the investigation was ongoing, Jessica and Michael continued to settle into their new life in the coastal town. They found comfort in their daily routines and the simple joys of their new home. The beach walks, the sunsets, and the sense of peace they had found together were a stark contrast to the chaos of the past. Eventually, the journalist's work culminated in a compelling expose that was published in major news outlets. The truth about Richard's manipulation, her father's innocence, and the deceit that had tainted their lives was finally revealed. Public opinion shifted, and Jessica's father's memory began to be restored. Jessica felt a deep sense of relief and accomplishment. The truth had been revealed, and the past was no longer shrouded in lies. Her father's name was cleared, and the weight of Richard's deceit was lifted from her shoulders. In the quiet moments that followed, as she looked out at the sea and felt the cool breeze on her face, Jessica knew that the journey had been worth it. She had faced the darkest parts of her past, reclaimed her father's legacy, and found a new sense of freedom. With Michael by her side, Jessica felt ready to embrace the future with hope and optimism. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she knew she had the strength to face whatever came next. The past had been a burden, but it had also paved the way for a new beginning, one where she could live authentically and build a life defined by truth, love, and freedom. Jessica's emotions were a whirlwind of relief, sorrow, and newfound clarity. The letters had shattered her previous beliefs and painted a more complex picture of her father. The realization that he had been a victim of Richard's ruthless manipulation was both painful and illuminating. "Michael, I need to do something with this," Jessica said, looking at the stack of letters. "I can't just keep this hidden away. My father's story, his true story, needs to be shared. People need to know what really happened." Michael nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. The truth needs to be told, not only for your father's sake but for your own peace of mind as well. It's important to set the record straight." Jessica agreed. She began drafting a statement that would explain her father's innocence and the extent of Richard's deceit. She wanted to ensure that the narrative was clear and that the public understood the full scope of the manipulation. As she worked on the statement, Michael helped by offering feedback and encouragement. Together, they prepared a comprehensive account of the truth, which included the documents and letters that Emily had sent. Once the statement was finalized, Jessica reached out to journalists and media outlets, making sure that her father's story would be given the attention it deserved. It was a difficult and emotionally draining process, but Jessica felt a sense of purpose and determination driving her forward. The response from the public was overwhelming. The media coverage brought to light the extent of Richard's manipulations and restored Jessica's father's reputation. The support she received from friends, the community, and even strangers was heartwarming. Despite the public vindication, Jessica found the personal process of reconciliation to be the most important. She spent time reflecting on her father's life, honoring his memory by visiting his grave and speaking at a memorial event dedicated to his legacy. The experience was both healing and empowering. Jessica's journey had not only brought justice for her father, but also allowed her to reclaim her own life from the shadows of the past. She and Michael continued to build their life together, finding solace in their shared experiences and the new chapter they were creating. As they walked along the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore, Jessica felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but she had emerged stronger and more resolute. "Thank you for being here with me through all of this," Jessica said softly, turning to Michael. "I couldn't have done it without you." Michael smiled and squeezed her hand. "I'm just glad to be by your side. You faced so much with incredible strength and grace. You've made a difference, and you found your way to healing." Jessica nodded, feeling the warmth of Michael's support. As they continued their walk, the sunset casting a golden glow over the ocean, Jessica knew that her future was filled with possibilities. The past had been a part of her journey, but it no longer defined her. She was ready to embrace the future with hope, love, and a renewed sense of freedom. Michael approached with a playful grin, and Jessica raised an eyebrow, curious about what was on his mind. They had found a rhythm in their daily routine, one that brought them both solace and joy after the tumultuous journey they had endured. "Good morning," Michael said, sliding into the chair across from her with a twinkle in his eye. "I have something special planned for today." Jessica looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "Oh, and what might that be?" Michael's grin widened. "I've been thinking about how far you've come and how you've turned your life around. I wanted to celebrate this new chapter with you in a special way." Jessica leaned in, intrigued. "Celebrate how?" Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He opened it to reveal a delicate necklace with a pendant shaped like a small wave. "This is a reminder," Michael said softly, "of the journey you've been on and the new beginning you've embraced. The wave symbolizes strength and resilience, and I thought it would be a fitting symbol of how you've weathered the storm and come out stronger." Jessica's eyes misted over as she took the necklace from Michael. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you." "Oh." Michael gently clasped the necklace around her neck. "You deserve it. You've done something incredible, not just for your father, but for yourself as well." As Jessica touched the pendant, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. The necklace was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of her journey, her struggles, and her triumphs. It reminded her of the strength she had discovered within herself and the new life she was building with Michael by her side. "Thank you," Jessica repeated, her heart full. "This means a lot to me." Michael took her hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "Let's make today special. How about a day trip to that little vineyard you love? We can enjoy some wine and take a break from everything." Jessica's face lit up with a smile. "That sounds perfect." As they set off for the vineyard, Jessica felt a renewed sense of hope and joy. The past had left its marks, but she had emerged from it with a deeper understanding of herself and her own strength. With Michael's support and the promise of a new beginning, she was ready to embrace whatever the future held. The day at the vineyard was a tranquil escape. They enjoyed a leisurely lunch, sipped on fine wine, and wandered through the picturesque landscape, savoring the beauty of the countryside. It was a day of celebration and reflection, a moment to cherish the peace they had found together. As the sun began to set and the vineyard's rolling hills were bathed in golden light, Jessica and Michael sat on a quiet hill, overlooking the sprawling vineyards. They shared their dreams for the future and spoke of the life they wanted to build together. Jessica felt a deep sense of contentment. The journey had been long and arduous, but she had found her way to a place of peace and happiness. With Michael's love and support, she knew she was ready to face the future with confidence and hope. As they watched the sun dip below the horizon, Jessica felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. The future was no longer a daunting unknown, but a canvas waiting to be painted with new experiences and possibilities. And with the wave pendant glinting softly in the fading light, she knew that she was prepared to embrace it all. Michael's eyes lit up with pride and excitement As he heard Jessica's newfound determination, he took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I'll make some calls today," he said. "We can visit the city and meet with the women involved in the foundation. They're eager to get started, and I'm sure they'll be thrilled to meet you." Jessica's heart swelled with anticipation. She had been searching for a purpose beyond the peace she had found in the village, and now it seemed that purpose was within her grasp. The idea of using her experiences to empower other women felt not only fulfilling but also like a natural next step in her journey. "Thank you, Michael," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have reached this point without your support. This means so much to me." Michael smiled warmly. "You've done all the hard work yourself. I'm just here to help you take the next steps. I believe in you, Jessica." The following days were a whirlwind of preparation and excitement. Jessica and Michael made plans to visit the nearby city and connect with the entrepreneurial women who were building the foundation. They arranged meetings, gathered information, and prepared to take the first steps toward this new chapter. On the day of their visit, Jessica felt a mix of nervousness and exhilaration. As they arrived in the city, she was struck by its energy and vibrancy so different from the quiet village she had come to love. Michael was by her side, offering words of encouragement as they approached their first meeting. The room was filled with dynamic women who were passionate about their mission. Jessica introduced herself and shared her story, speaking with honesty and conviction. The room was quiet as she spoke, the gravity of her experiences resonating deeply with those present. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Many of the women came forward to express their admiration and gratitude. They spoke of their own experiences and the hope that Jessica's story would inspire others to take action and seek help. One of the leaders of the foundation, a woman named Clara, approached Jessica with a warm smile. "Your story is incredibly powerful," Clara said. "We've been looking for someone with your strength and insight to help guide our efforts. Your experience will be invaluable to the women we aim to support." Jessica felt a surge of hope and determination. "I'd be honored to be a part of this," she said sincerely. "I want to help others find their strength and overcome their challenges, just as I have." Clara nodded, clearly pleased. "Let's get started then. We have a lot to do, but I believe together we can make a real difference." As Jessica and Michael left the meeting, Jessica felt a profound sense of purpose. The path ahead was filled with potential, and she was ready to embrace it with all her heart. Michael, ever supportive, wrapped an arm around her shoulders as they walked back to their car. "You did great today," he said. "I'm so proud of you." Jessica leaned into him, her heart full of gratitude and excitement. "Thank you. I'm ready to make a difference, and I couldn't have done it without you." With the foundation of the new project laid and a clear vision for the future, Jessica felt a renewed sense of hope and purpose. She was embarking on a journey that would not only help others, but also bring her closer to the woman she was meant to become. The challenges of the past were behind her, and the future was bright with promise. Jessica's heart raced as she heard Michael's urgent tone. She could sense the gravity of the situation, and her mind immediately flashed back to the tumultuous days of Richard's manipulation. Without hesitation, she grabbed her coat and headed out of the office, driving swiftly back to the coastal village. As she arrived at their home, the storm outside seemed to mirror the chaos within. Michael met her at the door, his expression tense and worried. "He's in the living room," Michael said quietly. "I tried to keep him at bay, but he's demanding to speak with you." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Despite the progress she had made, the thought of facing Richard again brought a wave of anxiety. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and followed Michael inside. The living room was dimly lit, the storm outside casting erratic shadows on the walls. Richard stood in the center of the room, his presence imposing even in the darkness. His eyes were cold and calculating as he turned to face Jessica. "Jessica," he said with a twisted smirk, "I didn't expect to see you here. It's been a while." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop an 8 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Jessica met his gaze with steely resolve. "What are you doing here, Richard?" she demanded. "You've been out of our lives. We have nothing to discuss." Richard's smirk widened. "Oh, but we do," he said. "I've been following your little crusade. It's impressive how you've managed to clear your father's name and turn your life around. But don't think for a second that I've forgotten or forgiven." Jessica felt a surge of anger. "You're out of your mind if you think you can intimidate me again. I've moved on, and I'm not afraid of you." Richard laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Moved on? You think you're free from me? I've always had contingencies, Jessica. There are people who owe me favors, and they're not too happy with how you've disrupted my plans. If you think you've won, think again." Before Jessica could respond, a loud crash from the hallway startled her. She and Michael exchanged worried glances as they rushed to investigate. The scene that greeted them was one of chaos. Several men, hired by Richard, had broken into the house, overturning furniture and causing a mess. Michael stepped in front of Jessica protectively. "Get out of my house," he ordered. "You're not welcome here." Richard raised his hand, signaling his men to stop. "Don't waste your energy," he said, his voice cold. "I'm not here to fight. I just wanted to remind you that the darkness I brought into your life is not so easily erased. You may have found a new purpose, but I can still make things difficult." Jessica took a step forward, her voice steady. "You can try all you want, Richard, but your power is waning. We fought too hard to let you control us. This ends now." Richard's eyes narrowed, but he could see the determination in Jessica's gaze. "We'll see about that," he said, turning on his heel and walking toward the door. "But remember, Jessica, the shadows of the past can be hard to escape." With that, Richard and his men left the house, their departure leaving Jessica and Michael in stunned silence. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the house there was a tense calm. Jessica turned to Michael, her heart pounding. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael nodded, though his face was pale. "I'm fine, but we need to get the police involved and secure the house. Richard won't stop here." Jessica nodded, her mind already racing with the steps they needed to take. The confrontation with Richard had been a stark reminder that, despite her progress, she was still entangled in the aftermath of his manipulation. But she also knew that she couldn't let him undermine the life she had fought so hard to rebuild. As the storm outside continued to howl, Jessica and Michael worked together to protect their home and ensure their safety. The events of the night had shaken them, but they were determined to face whatever came next with the strength and resilience they had cultivated. With each step, Jessica was reminded of the importance of the work she was doing with the foundation and the need to stay vigilant. Richard's presence was a reminder that the fight for justice and healing was far from over, but with Michael by her side, she was ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead. Absolute dread seized Jessica as she slammed the phone down, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The terrifying urgency of her pulse pushed her into a frantic sprint, the pavement blurring beneath her feet as she raced home, her heart pounding with the weight of unspoken fears. Each second felt agonizingly slow, the horror of what could await her growing in intensity with every step. As she rounded the corner to her house, a cold chill ran down her spine. The front door was slightly ajar. The sight of it sent a bolt of panic through her, like icy fingers wrapping around her throat, squeezing tighter with each breath. She paused for the briefest moment at the threshold, the eerie silence inside the house so thick it felt alive. Then, faint but unmistakable, she heard a furious argument, voices escalating into a maelstrom of rage. The sound gripped her by the throat, propelling her forward, even though every fiber of her being screamed to turn and run. Her breath hitched as she stepped inside, her world unraveling before her eyes. The house was in disarray, the signs of chaos everywhere: overturned chairs, shattered glass glistening across the floor like sharp, accusing stars, and the dull thud of something or someone being thrown against the wall in the living room. Her heart stopped cold as she saw them. Richard, his face twisted into an expression of pure, unfiltered hatred, was locked in a savage, primal struggle with Michael. Both men were drenched in sweat, their movements wild and violent, their bodies slamming into furniture with reckless force. Michael, his face etched with desperation, was struggling to restrain Richard, whose rage was as consuming as a fire threatening to engulf everything in its path. "Jessica, get out!" Michael's voice cracked, a desperate plea laced with panic, but she couldn't move. Her legs were frozen to the spot, her eyes wide with terror as they took in the scene before her. Richard's eyes flicked toward her, and the moment their gazes locked, she felt a cold, cruel shiver run down her spine. His eyes were dead, filled with a hatred so visceral it seemed to reach out and choke the air around him. "I don't think you've won, Jessica." His voice was venomous, dripping with a twisted sense of satisfaction. His lips curled into a smile that made her stomach turn. "You think you've taken everything from me, but you're wrong. You haven't even begun to pay for what you've done." Before she could react, Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, jagged device, a homemade detonator. Jessica's blood ran cold as the reality of the situation slammed into her like a freight train. The device gleamed in the low light, its purpose clear and horrifying. Richard had come prepared for destruction, for revenge that went beyond mere violence. He was ready to burn everything to the ground, to obliterate everything she held dear. Time seemed to slow down as her mind raced, scrambling for a way to stop the madness unfolding before her eyes. But Richard was already moving, his hands shaking as he began to manipulate the device. "Richard, no!" Jessica screamed, her voice raw with fear. She took a step forward, her body shaking uncontrollably. "You don't have to do this. Please, just stop." But Richard's laughter, maniacal, hollow, cut through her like a blade. He wasn't listening. He didn't care. His fingers continued to work the detonator with terrifying precision. Panic surged through her, turning her vision into a blur of dread and despair. "Michael, help!" Jessica cried, her voice trembling. Michael was already lunging at Richard, his movements desperate, but the situation had escalated too far. The room felt like it was collapsing in on itself, the air thick with the electric charge of impending doom. The detonator tumbled from Richard's hand in the struggle, hitting the ground with a menacing thud. Its ominous beeping filled the room, a chilling reminder that time was running out. Jessica's heart slammed against her ribs as she dropped to her knees, frantically scrambling toward the device. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the wires, the colors blurring in her vision. Was it the red wire? The blue one? Her knowledge of electronics felt distant, like something she had learned in another life, now unreachable in the chaos of the moment. Sweat dripped from her brow as she worked, her fingers slick and clumsy with fear. In the corner of her eye, she saw Richard break free from Michael's grip, shoving him so hard that Michael crashed to the floor, dazed and bloodied. Richard's face was contorted with rage, a feral snarl escaping his lips as he advanced toward her. "Don't you dare!" he growled, his voice thick with malice. But Jessica wasn't listening. Her world had narrowed to the detonator in front of her, the beeping growing louder, faster, more insistent. She had to stop it. She had to. Suddenly, the world exploded. The blast wasn't full, but it was enough to send shockwaves through the room. Jessica was hurled back against the wall with bone-shattering force. Pain exploded in her side as she hit the ground, the air knocked from her lungs in a desperate gasp. Debris rained down around her, and for a moment, she couldn't move. The world spun in a dizzying haze of dust, smoke, and rubble. Through the haze, she saw Michael, blood pouring from a gash on his forehead, his body sprawled lifelessly on the ground. Panic gripped her as she dragged herself toward him, her body screaming in protest with every inch. "Michael," she whimpered, her voice barely more than a broken whisper. "Michael, please." Tears streamed down her face as she reached him, shaking him with trembling hands. His skin was cold, his breathing shallow, and she felt the weight of helplessness crush down on her chest. Somewhere in the distance, Richard's furious screams echoed, but they were muffled, drowned out by the chaos of the explosion. She could barely see him, trapped beneath a fallen beam, his anger reduced to incoherent roars of pain. But Jessica didn't care about him. Her whole world had shrunk to this moment, to the man lying motionless before her. "Michael, wake up," she sobbed, her hands shaking as she tried to rouse him. The room was in shambles, smoke curling through the air like a suffocating veil. The house that had once been her home was now a war zone, broken and shattered beyond recognition. And yet, all that mattered was Michael, his life slipping away before her eyes, and the helplessness that consumed her whole. With a final, desperate cry, Jessica collapsed beside him, her world fading into darkness. Michael slowly blinked his eyes open, his face pale, each breath a struggle. The sharp pain coursing through his body was a reminder of the horrors they'd just survived. Beside him, Jessica, equally battered and bruised, struggled to push herself off the ground. Their injuries were severe, but they both knew that staying there wasn't an option. Time was slipping away, and every second mattered. As Jessica scanned the wreckage of what had once been her home, her eyes landed on Richard. Trapped beneath a mound of debris, his body pinned and unable to move, the man who had brought so much pain was now helpless, unable to continue his reign of terror. With her last reserves of strength, Jessica forced herself to her feet, each step toward Richard agonizing. Her body screamed in protest, but she wouldn't let it stop her. As she approached, she saw the fury still burning in Richard's eyes, though his power was gone, reduced to nothing but hatred. "Your reign of terror is over, Richard," she whispered, her voice hoarse and strained but filled with a quiet, unyielding resolve. "No more harm, no more lies." Richard snarled, the remnants of his anger flaring briefly, but he knew the truth. He was finished, defeated by the very destruction he had sought to create. Jessica turned away from him, the weight of the moment heavy on her shoulders. The nightmare had finally ended. As the minutes passed, the darkness outside gave way to the first light of dawn. The sun crept slowly over the horizon, casting warm hues of red and orange across the sky, in stark contrast to the devastation that lay beneath it. The soft glow painted the remnants of Jessica's home in a surreal light, as if nature itself sought to bring peace to the chaos that had unfolded. The storm of violence had passed, but its aftermath lingered in every corner of the shattered living room. Jessica and Michael were discovered by first responders not long after. Both were gravely injured, their bodies marked by the physical toll of the explosion and confrontation, but miraculously they had survived. Paramedics rushed them to the hospital, where the extent of their injuries became clear. Jessica had suffered multiple fractures and a concussion, while Michael's leg was broken, and his body bore deep bruises and contusions. The road to recovery would be long, and each step filled with pain, but they were alive, something that had seemed so uncertain just hours before. Richard, trapped beneath the wreckage, had been subdued by his own actions. He was rearrested on the spot, the full weight of his crimes finally crushing him as authorities hauled him away. This time, there would be no escape. His manipulation, his cruelty, and his violent outbursts became the subject of a national scandal, exposing the depths of his malice to the world. His reign of terror had come to an end, and the justice he had evaded for so long was finally catching up to him. The days in the hospital were hard. Jessica and Michael lay in their respective rooms, separated by walls but bound by the shared trauma they had endured. Doctors and nurses worked diligently to heal their bodies, but the emotional scars ran far deeper. Each quiet moment was filled with reflection, their minds grappling with the enormity of what had happened. They had survived the unthinkable, but survival came at a cost. The weight of tragedy clung to them, settling like a dark cloud over the sterile hospital rooms. A week passed before they were discharged. Physically, they were still broken, and Jessica's house, now little more than a ruin, would need to be entirely rebuilt. The foundation had survived, but like their lives, it needed to be reshaped, reorganized. The damage was undeniable, but it wasn't insurmountable. On the day of their release, Jessica and Michael found a quiet corner in the hospital garden. The sun shone warmly, a stark contrast to the cold reality they faced. The garden was serene, filled with blooming flowers and chirping birds, yet an unspoken heaviness hung between them. They sat on a bench, the silence stretching, neither quite knowing how to begin the conversation they both knew was coming. "I can't believe everything we've been through," Jessica murmured, her voice barely audible as she stared at the ground. The weight of exhaustion clung to her words. "It's more than I could have ever imagined. I've lost so much. But I've also gained a new perspective on life, on everything." Michael nodded, his gaze distant, fixed on the horizon. "I know, we've come through so much, but it's left me with a lot to think about. This time in the hospital, what we've been through, it's changed things." Jessica felt her chest tighten. She sensed that something important was coming, something that would change everything between them. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked up at him, a mixture of hope and dread swirling inside her. "What are you saying, Michael?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael sighed deeply, his eyes filled with both affection and sorrow. He was searching for the right words, the ones that would convey the complex emotions he had been grappling with since the ordeal began. "Jessica," he began, his voice soft but firm, "we've been through so much together, and I've seen your strength and your kindness. You've been incredible through all of this. But despite everything we've been through, and the feelings that have grown between us, I think the best thing for both of us is to part ways." Jessica's heart clenched painfully, his words hitting her like a physical blow. The knot in her stomach twisted tighter, but she fought to remain calm. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking despite her efforts to steady it. "Why can't we find a way to move forward together?" Michael turned to her, his eyes filled with sadness but also honesty. "It's not because I don't care about you," he said gently. "In fact, it's the opposite. I care about you deeply. But what we've been through, it's been incredibly intense and traumatic. We need time to heal, Jessica, to rebuild our lives separately, before we can even think about what the future holds. Right now, our paths need to be apart. We need to find peace within ourselves, before we can find it with anyone else." If you're still tuned into this video, and find the story inspiring, drop a 9 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes, her heart aching with the truth of his words. She wanted to argue, to fight for a different outcome, but deep down she knew he was right. They had both been through hell, and neither of them could begin to heal while they were still drowning in the aftermath. "You're right," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We need time to figure out who we are outside of this storm. Maybe someday, when we found ourselves again, we can find each other too." Michael gently reached out and took her hand, a gesture of comfort and understanding. His touch was warm, but the space between them felt impossibly wide. "What we've been through will always be a part of us," he said softly. "I'll never forget it, or you. But we both deserve the chance to find stability, to heal. I want you to be happy, Jessica, and for that to happen, we need to give ourselves the time and space to heal separately." Jessica nodded, her tears flowing freely now, but they were tears of acceptance, of understanding. She knew this was the right decision, no matter how much it hurt. The future was uncertain, but in that moment, under the warm sun in the hospital garden, they made peace with the past and with the parting that lay ahead. At that moment, the sun broke through the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the hospital garden, illuminating their faces with a sense of quiet serenity. The rays of light bathed them in a soft embrace, a symbol of the new day and the fresh beginnings awaiting them. They shared one final embrace, holding on for a moment longer, knowing this was goodbye not just to each other but to the chaos, pain, and everything that had bound them in the storm. There was sorrow in that hug, but also an unspoken promise of hope and healing. As they pulled away, there was a sense of peace between them. Life, with all its unpredictable twists and turns, would surely bring more challenges and opportunities. Their paths had diverged, but the bond they had formed, forged in the fire of tragedy, would remain. It was a connection they would carry with them, even as they stepped into different futures. Jessica returned to rebuild the foundations of her life literally and figuratively. With unwavering determination, she oversaw the reconstruction of her home, pouring her energy and dedication into creating something new from the ashes. It wasn't just about the bricks and mortar, it was about her soul healing, piecing together her sense of self that had been shattered in the chaos. Each day brought small victories, and with each step forward, she grew stronger, more resilient. The ruins of the past became the soil from which her new life blossomed. Michael, too, found his own way forward. He chose to travel, to explore the world and rediscover the parts of himself that had been lost in the turmoil. The journey became one of self-reflection and growth, each destination offering him new insights and a renewed sense of purpose. Though the wounds from their shared past remained, they slowly healed, leaving scars that reminded him of not only the pain, but the strength he had found in overcoming it. As time passed, both Jessica and Michael found peace within themselves. Their lives, once so intertwined, now moved along separate courses. Yet, on the horizon of their individual journeys, hope shone brightly. The tragedies they had faced had left marks, but they had also forged resilience and the capacity for transformation. Both had discovered new depths of inner strength and the courage to embrace the unknown. The chapter of their relationship had closed, but their stories were far from over. Jessica and Michael continued to walk their own paths, each moving toward fulfillment, peace, and a future shaped by their own choices. And while they didn't know what lay ahead, they faced it with hearts open to possibility and the knowledge that, no matter what, they had survived, grown, and come out stronger. Life, in all its unpredictability, was theirs to live fully, and the road ahead, though separate, was filled with endless potential. As we come to the end of this powerful story, we've seen how tragedy, loss, and difficult choices can shape us into stronger individuals. Jessica and Michael's journey reminds us that even through the darkest times, there is always hope for renewal and personal growth. Now, we want to hear from you. What have you learned from their story? What lesson will you take with you and apply in your own life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to know how this story has impacted you and what you will bring into practice in your journey. If you liked this video, please leave your comment below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring stories and life lessons. Thank you for watching.